200 guests stood beneath the candlelight of the Thornbury townhouse, and not one of them noticed the folded paper tucked inside a gray glove. Philippa had worn gray to her own wedding once, a color chosen to apologize for existing. Tonight, she wore no apology at all. The musicians faltered somewhere in the second measure. A footman near the doorway forgot his posture entirely. Every fan in the room stopped its slow, indifferent motion at precisely the same instant, because the woman the ton had spent a year calling ruined had just walked through the door on the arm of a duke, and she was smiling. Her father saw her first. His wineglass did not shake, not yet, though the knuckles wrapped around its stem had already gone white. 3 feet away, her sister was laughing at something Lord Rushford had said, radiant in white silk. A diamond settled at her throat like a small cold star. Utterly unaware that the evening had already ended for her, though the clock had not yet struck 10. Nobody in that room understood what the folded paper could do. Not the guests whispering behind their fans. Not the young lord about to lose everything he thought he wanted. Not even the man standing at Philippa's shoulder, who had already paid a price of his own to bring her this far, and did not yet know whether it had been worth it. Only Philippa knew what waited inside that single sheet of vellum, and she had learnt, over 11 months, exactly how to wait before she used it. The letter would ruin someone tonight. She had simply not yet decided how slowly. 11 months before that, the only doors that mattered were made of oak, and they closed behind her for good. On the morning of her wedding, Philippa Trewartha sat at the dressing table in her childhood room at Carrow Manor and watched her sister choose which parts of her face to leave uncovered. Henrietta worked with a steady hand and a set of small brushes borrowed from her own dressing case, and she was, Philippa had to admit, skilled at the task. A little powder along the jaw where the yellow had not quite faded from purple. A veil of fine gray gauze, thick enough to blur what the powder could not hide, thin enough that no guest could later claim they had been denied a proper look at the bride. Henrietta hummed under her breath as she worked, some tune Philippa did not recognize, light and pleased, the humming of a girl dressing for her own happy occasion rather than her sister's exile, and Henrietta stood back at last and studied her work with the same critical eye she gave to her own reflection each morning. "There," she said. "Nobody will know a thing." "You knew," Philippa said. "You were there." Henrietta's hands paused over the brush case for the length of one breath, no longer, and then resumed their tidying as though nothing at all had been said. "That is a very strange thing to say to me on your wedding day, Pippa. I do hope His Grace finds you more agreeable than you are being with me." Downstairs, their father was already dressed in unrelieved black, a mourning band on his sleeve for a grief he did not feel, and when Philippa came down the stairs, he looked at her the way a man looks at a debt finally being carried out of the house. He did not offer his arm until the carriage was waiting, and even then his grip closed hard enough around her elbow that she knew, without needing to look, exactly what color the mark would be by evening. He spoke to her only once during the short drive, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window rather than on her face. "See that you give His Grace no cause for complaint. You have cost this family a great deal already, and I do not intend to hear of any further cost." Philippa watched her father's profile, the tight set of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against his knee, in a rhythm that had nothing to do with patience. She had noticed it more often these past months, that restlessness, though she had not yet found the shape of what caused it. She said nothing in answer. There was nothing left to say to a man who had decided, weeks ago, exactly what use she still had left to be. The rain began before they reached the church and had not stopped since. Sir Josiah handed her down from the carriage without a word, his umbrella tilted to keep the worst of the weather from his own coat rather than from her veil, and she walked the last few yards to the porch with the rain, finding every seam in her cloak, the hem of her gray gown already soaked through by the time they reached the door. The parish church at Porthgullo smelled of wet granite and tallow smoke, and faintly, beneath both, of the sea. It was a building made to withstand weather rather than to welcome anyone into it, low and square-shouldered under a sky the color of an old bruise. Rain struck the narrow windows in long gray sheets and found its way, somehow, past the edge of Philippa's cloak until the wool sat cold and heavy against her shoulders. The pews held perhaps 30 souls, no more, a scattering of gentry come from as far as Truro for the pleasure of seeing a ruined woman married off, and a handful of Porthgullo families who fished and farmed the Trewortha land and had come, she understood, out of loyalty to a mother long since buried in the churchyard outside, rather than any fondness for the bride herself. Philippa was grateful for the second sort, and did not look too long at the first, whose eyes she could feel moving over her veil like fingers searching for a seam. She stood before the altar with her hands folded around a small bundle of white camellias, and she did not feel the cold at all. Her father walked her down the short aisle with the same grip he had used at the foot of the stairs. Sir Josiah Trewortha did not look at his daughter as he walked. He looked past her at the man waiting beneath the chancel arch, and there was something in his face that a stranger might have mistaken for grief. Philippa knew better. It was relief, dressed carefully in black superfine. Behind them came Henrietta, 19, lovely in pale rose silk entirely unsuited to the weather, dabbing at eyes that produced no tears whatsoever. She had arranged her face into an expression of tender sorrow the moment they left Carrow Manor, and she had not once let it slip in the whole of the journey. "Pippa," Henrietta whispered as they reached the front pew loud enough to carry, "if only you had been more careful, but His Grace is a generous man to take you regardless." Her fingers found the edge of Philippa's veil and adjusted it, an unnecessary correction that pressed, just for a moment, against the fading bruise along her jaw. Philippa did not flinch. She had trained herself out of flinching weeks ago, the way one trains a limb to bear weight again after a break, slowly and at considerable cost. But something in her chest went very still, and Henrietta's smile, when it came, held no warmth at all. The vicar cleared his throat and began. Philippa did not hear most of it. She heard the rain instead, and the particular silence of a church too small for the number of people trying not to stare at her. She was aware of the man standing across from her in the way one is aware of weather approaching, a change in the air before a storm arrives. He was tall and still, and he watched her with an attention that felt entirely unlike curiosity. Once, briefly, she saw his gaze move to the side of her face, where the veil sat thickest, and linger there a moment too long before he looked away again. When the vicar asked whether she took this man, she found that her own voice had gone somewhere else entirely, and several seconds passed before it returned to her. "I do," she said, and the words came out flat and small, like a stone dropped into a well too deep to hear it land. He took her left hand for the ring. His own hand was warm and dry, and closed around hers, with a care that surprised her more than she wished it to. She watched his face rather than her own fingers as the ring slid on, slightly too large, and she saw the exact moment his thumb passed over the hard callus at the base of hers, and the thin healing scratch just above her wrist. His expression did not change, but his eyes came up to meet hers once, sharp and assessing, and Philippa understood, with a small cold drop of certainty, that he had noticed. She did not know yet what a man like that did with things he noticed. There was no kiss. He offered his arm instead, and she took it, and they walked back down the aisle together, while her father remained under the porch, unwilling to step into the rain to see them off, and her sister called some final soft cruelty after her that the wind carried away before it landed. Behind them the small congregation rose and began, in low voices, the particular kind of talk that follows a wedding nobody quite believed would happen. Philippa did not turn to hear any of it. She had spent the better part of a year learning not to turn toward voices that spoke of her only when they believed she could not hear. The carriage was dark and smelled of leather and damp wool, and for the first several miles neither of them spoke. Philippa sat with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap and watched the hedgerows blur past the streaming glass, gray on gray on gray, until Porthgullo was well behind them and the road climbed inland toward higher ground. She knew a little of him already, the way one knows the weather in a county one has never visited. He had spent 10 years untangling his father's debts, it was said, refusing every fashionable extravagance until the tenant farms stood on firmer ground than they had in a generation. He was accounted a hard man in matters of business, and a fair one, which in her limited experience of gentlemen very rarely traveled together. She had wondered, in the weeks since the arrangement was settled, which of the two she would find seated across from her in this carriage. It was the Duke of Calderwood who broke the silence, eventually in a voice pitched low enough that it barely rose above the sound of the wheels. "I will have my physician look at your neck when we reach Nanscon," he said. Philippa's hand went, without her permission, to the collar of her cloak, drawing it higher. "That will not be necessary, Your Grace. It is healing well enough on its own." "Did your father do that?" I fell. The lie came easily. It always did by now. She had said it so many times that it no longer felt like a lie so much as a small worn coin she carried and handed over whenever it was demanded of her. He was quiet for a moment, studying her with that same unreadable attention. Then he said, in the tone of a man laying terms upon a table, "Let us be plain with one another, madam, since we are unlikely to have much use for anything else between us. This is a contract, nothing more. Your father wished you settled well outside London. I required, in turn, the shore rights along Porthgullo that come with you, in order to build a landing deep enough for merchant vessels before the packet trade finishes dying and takes half the parish down with it. I have spent 10 years pulling this family's finances out of the debts my own father left behind, and I do not intend to watch the work undone now for want of a proper harbor. I did not marry you for affection, and I do not expect any from you. You will want for nothing at Nanscowen. In return, I ask only that you bring no further scandal to my door." "May I ask a question in return, Your Grace?" He inclined his head, faintly surprised, as though he had not expected the offer of terms to invite a reply at all. "The shore rights you mention, are they entailed with the rest of my father's land or held separately?" It was an odd question for a bride to ask on her wedding day, and she watched him register that oddness before he answered. "Separately, as it happens. Your father held them outside the entail through your mother's family, and settled them upon you directly in the marriage articles." "Why do you ask?" "No reason," she said, and looked back to the window, though it was, in fact, the only reason that mattered to her at all. She had expected tears to be demanded of her, or an explanation, or some performance of shame he could then graciously forgive. She gave him none of it. "I understand perfectly," she said. "I require very little. I do not intend to trouble you." Something in his face shifted briefly, though she could not have said what. He did not press her further, and the rest of the journey passed in a silence that felt, if not comfortable, then at least honest. She spent the remaining miles watching the moor give way to cultivated fields, and then to the first dark line of trees marking Nanscowen's boundary, and she thought, without quite meaning to, of her mother, 6 years in the ground now behind the church at Porthgullo, who had always said that a Trewortha daughter ought to understand exactly what she owned before anyone else had the chance to tell her otherwise. Philippa had been too young at the time to understand why her mother had insisted upon it with such quiet, unyielding patience. She understood a great deal more of it now, sitting in a stranger's carriage with a stranger's ring loose upon her finger, though she could not yet have said precisely what use that understanding was going to be. Nanscowen appeared out of the rain, and the failing light some hours later, a long gray house of granite and slate set against a fold of hillside above dark water. Below it, just visible in the last gray light, lay a narrow stone quay reaching out into the estuary, too shallow and too short. Philippa understood without being told, for whatever purpose its owner had in mind for it. The house itself stood with its windows lit gold against the storm, as though it had been waiting for them specifically, and had grown tired of waiting some hours before. A line of servants waited on the steps, despite the hour and the weather, and at their head stood a broad, upright woman, with hair the color of iron, scraped back beneath a plain cap. "Your Grace," the woman said, dipping a curtsy to Nathaniel, and then with a longer, more careful look, to Philippa. "This is Mrs. Chegwin. She keeps this house better than I could ever hope to." Mrs. Chegwin's eyes went, briefly and without any real attempt at concealment, to the single battered trunk the coachman was lifting down from the boot. One trunk. It sat alone on the wet gravel, small and shabby, everything her father had thought his eldest daughter worth sending away with. Something crossed the housekeeper's broad face, gone as quickly as it came, though Philippa recognized it well enough. She had seen the same brief, careful pity on the faces of the Porthgullo fisherwomen, who had come to the church that morning out of loyalty to her mother's memory rather than any fondness for the bride. She did not want it here any more than she had wanted it there. I packed lightly, Philippa said, before the silence could stretch any further. Might someone show me to my rooms? Of course, Your Grace. This way. She followed Mrs. Chegwin up the wide stone steps and into a hall lit by a single hanging lamp, past a staircase that climbed up into shadow, and she did not look at any of it properly. Not the height of the ceiling, nor the age of the stone, nor the portraits watching her pass. Mrs. Chegwin talked as she walked, in the unhurried way of a woman accustomed to filling silences that made other people uncomfortable. The east wing gets the morning sun, Your Grace, which is more than most of this house can claim in November. I have had a fire laid in your rooms since noon, and I will send something hot up directly, whether you have the stomach for it tonight or not. You will want it by morning, even if you do not want it now. At the foot of the stairs, she stopped and turned, because there was one question she needed answered before she could climb another step in this house. Your Grace, she said. Nathaniel, who had been handing his sodden coat to a footman, looked up. Yes. The door to my rooms, she said, and made herself keep her voice level. Does it lock? It is a good oak door, madam, he said, frowning slightly, as though the question had caught him somewhere he had not expected to be caught. But no, none of the interior doors lock from within. There has never been cause. For one unguarded instant, something moved behind her eyes that she could not smooth away quickly enough. Not fear exactly, or not only fear, but something older and more practiced, the look of a creature that has learnt precisely how many seconds a door takes to be forced. She saw him see it. She watched the frown deepen, watched him take a step toward her before he caught himself and did not finish it. I see, she said, before he could ask the question forming behind his face. Thank you. Good night, Your Grace. She turned and went up the stairs without waiting to be dismissed, and it was only once she had reached the turn of the staircase, safely out of the light below, that she allowed herself to stop and breathe and press one hand flat against the cold plaster of the wall. The house was silent around her, vast and unfamiliar, full of doors she had not yet learnt to be afraid of. She would learn them soon enough. She always did. Through the gap in the balustrade, she could still see down into the hall, where the Duke of Calderwood remained precisely where she had left him, his wet coat still forgotten over the footman's arm, watching the empty stairs with the look of a man who has just been handed the first piece of a puzzle he had not known he was meant to solve. She held very still until, after a long moment, he seemed to recollect himself and turned away toward the library, and only then did she let her own breath go. 3 weeks passed at Nanscowen in a silence that was not unkind, only careful, the way two strangers sharing a coach are careful of one another's knees. Philippa learnt the shape of her new life quickly, because she had always learnt quickly, and because there was very little of it to learn. She took her meals across a long table from a husband who spoke to her mostly of weather and tides. She walked the cliff path above the house each morning before the rest of the household stirred, when the light was thin and gray and nobody was awake to watch her face for signs of what she was supposed to be feeling. She did not host callers, since none came. She did not write to her father, and he did not write to her. She had begun, without quite deciding to, counting the days since anyone had raised a hand to her, the way a sailor counts days since the last storm, not with relief exactly, but with a wariness that refused to soften into trust. Mrs. Chegwin, for her part, seemed to have decided within the first week that the new Duchess was a creature to be fed rather than questioned, and left small kindnesses in Philippa's path, with the same unhurried patience she brought to everything else. A plate of seed cake set beside her chair without comment, a shawl draped over the back of a bench on the terrace. Some morning she had noticed the wind had turned. Philippa accepted these offerings with a wariness that slowly over the course of 3 weeks began to feel less like wariness and more like something she did not yet have a name for. She had grown so accustomed at Cairo to kindness arriving only as a prelude to some later cost that it took her the best part of a fortnight simply to trust that Mrs. Chegwin's small attentions asked for nothing whatsoever in return. She still did not sleep well. She had not slept well in months. It was a little past 3 in the morning, in the last week of July, when she gave up on sleep entirely and went looking for a candle. Her own had guttered out an hour before, and rather than wake a maid at that hour over so small a thing, She had taken to finding her own way about the house in the dark, feeling along the cold stone with one hand until she reached the library, where a fire was sometimes still smoldering this late, and a fresh taper could usually be found among the desk things. She did not expect to find the room occupied. She pushed the door open on its quiet hinge and stepped inside in her nightgown and woolen wrapper, her bare feet silent on the old turkey rug, and it was only when a voice spoke out of the high-backed chair by the dying fire that she understood her mistake. "If you need light, there are matches in the top drawer of the desk." She gasped and dropped the candlestick she was carrying. It struck the hearthstone with a ring that seemed enormous in the sleeping house, and she spun toward the sound of his voice with her back already against the cold marble of the mantel before she had made any conscious decision to move there. Nathaniel did not rise from the chair. He remained where he was, a ledger open across his knee and a single lamp burning low beside him, and he watched her with the particular stillness of a man who has learnt, somewhere, that sudden movement is the wrong answer to a frightened animal. "I apologize," he said, his voice pitched low and even. "I did not mean to startle you. I often work late." "I could not sleep," she said, when she had breath enough to say anything at all. "The house is very dark. I only wanted a candle for my room." "Take the one from the desk," he said, and nothing more, and let her come to it in her own time. She crossed the room slowly, keeping a wide distance between them that he did not comment on, and reached into the pool of lamplight where a fresh taper lay beside his inkstand. It was as she leant across the desk that the sleeve of her wrapper slid back along her forearm, and she felt, rather than saw, the exact moment his eyes moved to it. His hand closed around her wrist before she had finished reaching. Not hard, not painful, but firm enough that she could not simply pull away, and she went rigid at the touch, her whole body going still and silent, the way it had learnt to go still and silent months before, waiting to discover how much this particular stillness was going to cost her. He did not squeeze. He turned her arm gently toward the lamp instead, and looked at what the light showed him there. A ring of 4 small bruises gone the color of a week-old storm cloud, set just above the thin white line of a healing scratch. "Who did this?" he asked. "Let me go," she said. Her eyes had squeezed shut without her permission. He released her at once. She heard him lean back in the chair, putting distance between them of his own accord, and when he spoke again, his voice had not changed at all, still low, still even, still entirely without threat in it. "I am not going to hurt you, Philippa. Look at me." She opened her eyes. He had not moved from the chair. The lamp threw long shadows up the spines of the books behind him, and his face in that light looked older than it had at the altar, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I asked you a question in the carriage," he said. "I asked whether your father struck you. You told me you fell. I did fall. A fall does not leave 4 fingers and a thumb," he said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet and very certain. Was it Vosper? The name landed in the room like a dropped stone. Philippa felt something crack open behind her ribs, some wall she had spent a great many weeks reinforcing, and what came out through the crack surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. "I have never in my life exchanged 10 words with Aubrey Vosper," she said, and her voice had gone strange, thin, and furious all at once. "I did not go to that inn. I did not choose to be found in that room. I drank a glass of ratafia at my sister's supper, and the next thing I understood of the world, I was lying in a bed I had never seen before, unable to feel my own legs properly, and there were people in the doorway already, as though they had been waiting for the door to open." Nathaniel had gone very still. "Waiting," he said. "That is what it felt like," she said. "Like a performance that had already been rehearsed, and I had simply arrived late for my own part in it." She told him the rest of it in pieces, because it did not come out any other way, not that night nor for a long while afterward. The supper at Carrow Manor in April, held to celebrate the first hint of interest from Lord Rushford's family in Henrietta, the drawing room warm and overfull, candles doubled for the occasion, her father in high spirits she had not seen in him for years. The glass Henrietta herself had pressed into her hand, laughing, insisting she drink to her sister's good fortune, and Philippa, wanting only for the evening to pass without incident, had drunk it without second thought, because why would a sister's hand ever be a thing to fear? The heaviness that followed, sudden and total, more than wine alone had ever done to her before, a warmth spreading through her limbs that felt, for one confused moment, almost pleasant before it became something closer to drowning. She remembered very little after that. A ceiling she did not recognize swimming somewhere above her. Voices in another room, low and businesslike, discussing something with the flat efficiency of men arranging a delivery of coal. Waking hours later at the Kestrel Inn in Truro, her bodice torn at the shoulder, in a manner she had certainly not torn it herself, with Aubrey Vosper sitting stupefied and unbuttoned on the far side of the room, and a physician her father had somehow already summoned standing in the doorway, with two ladies of the neighborhood. Behind him, their faces arranged into expressions of theatrical horror that had struck Philippa, even through the fog of whatever she had been given, as slightly too well composed for genuine surprise. "My father called it my ruin," she said. "He locked me in the north attic at Cairo for nearly a month, to spare Henrietta's engagement any taint of scandal by association, and told anyone who asked that I was unwell with a nervous complaint. When I screamed the truth out of the attic window, he had the shutters nailed closed." Nathaniel set the ledger aside on the desk with great care, as though the sound of it closing too loudly might undo something fragile in the room. "Why?" he said. "Why go to such trouble? If a man wishes a daughter ruined, there are simpler ways than drugging her and staging witnesses. A word in the right drawing room does the same work in half an evening, and costs nothing at all." "That is what I cannot make sense of either," Philippa said. "It was expensive. It was deliberate. Someone paid a physician to lie, and paid an innkeeper to look elsewhere, and paid Aubrey Vosper for something, though I could not say what, since the man barely seemed to know his own name that night. My father does not spend money he has not first counted twice. Whatever this cost him, he judged it worth the price. And you have no notion what that price bought him." "None that I can prove," she said, and something in the careful precision of the word prove made Nathaniel's eyes narrow slightly, though he did not press her on it. "I have asked myself the same question every night since April," Philippa went on. "I have not yet found an answer that satisfies me." She did not tell him, that night, about the marriage settlement her mother had left her, nor the sum attached to it, nor the particular clause that made a daughter's disgrace worth rather more to some people than her continued good name. She was not yet sure, herself, how much of that clause had anything to do with what had happened to her, and she had learnt, over 6 years of watching her father manage other people's trust, never to hand over a suspicion before she had evidence enough to make it useful. It was, she thought afterward, lying awake long after Nathaniel had at last persuaded her back toward the door of her own room, a strange sort of relief, to discover that some part of her still knew how to guard something carefully, even in the middle of finally letting the rest of it go. What she told him, instead, when he asked what she needed from him now, was simpler. "A lock," she said. "That is all. I do not require you to believe every word of what I have told you, Your Grace. I require a door that keeps its own counsel about who may open it." Nathaniel rose from the chair for the first time since she had entered the room, and in the lamplight his face had lost every trace of the tired, patient stillness he had worn a moment before. What replaced it was something harder, something that made her understand, for the first time, precisely how a man built an estate back out of 10 years of debt. "You will have your lock by tomorrow evening," he said, "and you will never again have cause to ask a servant in this house whether a door may be trusted." He was as good as his word. By the following afternoon, a broad, taciturn man named Rundle had arrived from the home farm with a canvas bag of tools and a face that asked no questions whatsoever. He worked without hurry, planing a recess into the old oak with the patient economy of a man who had fitted 1,000 doors before this one and expected to fit 1,000 more. And Philippa sat in the chair by the hearth and watched every stroke of his tools with an attention that had nothing to do with curiosity about carpentry. By evening the heavy door had a deadbolt fitted to it thick enough, Rundle observed without apparent irony, to have kept a bank vault honest. Nathaniel cleared the east wing of servants for the better part of an hour, and stood by the window with his arms folded while the work was done, watching the corridor rather than the door itself, as though he understood, without being told, that she needed a witness who was not looking directly at her. When it was finished, she crossed the room, gripped the bolt in both hands, and drew it home. It slid into its housing with a heavy, definite sound, and she stood there with her palm flat against the cool oak for a long moment afterward, listening to the particular silence of a room that had become, for the first time in a very long while, entirely her own. She tried the handle from the outside afterward, twice, simply to hear the door refuse her, and found, to her own faint surprise, that the sound of her own refusal was the sweetest thing she had heard in months. "Better," Nathaniel said from the corridor beyond the door. "Yes," she said through the wood. "Thank you." It was. She understood as she said it. The first time she had thanked him for anything and meant it entirely. The days that followed took on a different shape. Nathaniel did not press her again for the details she had not offered, but he began, without announcement, to leave the estate ledgers open on the library table each morning, where she was certain to see them. And after the third such morning, Philippa found herself sitting down across from him and asking, in a voice that surprised her with its own steadiness, what the columns meant. He explained without condescension, and corrected her without impatience when she erred, and by the second week of August she had begun, almost without noticing the change in herself, to look forward to the hour each morning when the two of them sat together over rents and tariffs and the slow, unglamorous business of keeping an estate solvent. "You are quicker with this than most gentlemen I have employed to do it," he told her one morning, not quite looking up from his own page, in a tone she could not immediately place as compliment or observation. "I was raised to read a column of figures the way other girls were raised to embroider," she said. "My mother thought it the more useful accomplishment." She did not, on that particular morning, explain any further, and he did not ask her to. But she noticed later that he had begun leaving the harder columns for her rather than the simpler ones, the freight tariffs, and the tangled accounts of the small stone quay below the house, which he explained, when she asked, was too shallow and too short for anything larger than a fishing lugger, and would need to be replaced entirely if Nanscowan's tenants were to have any trade at all. Once the packet service finished abandoning Falmouth for Southampton, as it was rumored more insistently every month to be doing. The shore rights her own marriage articles had brought him were only half of what such a project required, he told her, turning a page. The rest lay in duchy hands, and duchy leases were not won by charm alone. She found in the weeks that followed that she looked forward to these mornings, rather more than she was entirely willing to admit even to herself, not merely for the steady, undemanding companionship of them, though that alone would have been reason enough after a year that had offered her so very little of it, but for the particular pleasure of a mind allowed, after so long confined to smaller and more frightened uses, to stretch itself properly again. She had not realized until she sat across that desk from him each morning, with a column of figures waiting to be balanced, quite how much of herself she had spent the previous year holding carefully in check. It was during one such morning, her pen paused over a column of figures she was no longer quite seeing, that Philip found her mind wandering back, as it did more and more often, now that the terror of the thing had begun to loosen its grip on her, to the supper room at Carrow Manor in April, and the glass of ratafia, and the particular way her sister's hand had closed around hers to press it into her fingers. She had told Nathaniel it felt rehearsed. She had meant it as a figure of speech. Sitting now with a pen dry in her hand and the fire crackling low behind her, she turned the memory over again, more carefully this time, the way her mother had once taught her to turn over a clause in a deed until every word had given up its meaning. 4 glasses of ratafia had stood upon that tray. She had watched Henrietta lift the tray herself from the sideboard, a small enough courtesy that nobody in the room had thought to remark upon it. She had watched her sister's eyes move once across the room to their father before she crossed the floor, and she had thought nothing of it at the time, because a daughter's eyes finding her father's across a crowded room was hardly a thing worth noticing. It would not lie flat the way a memory of an accident was supposed to lie. There had been no accident in the timing of it. Henrietta had chosen that particular glass from among the others on the tray. Henrietta had chosen of all the guests in that room to press it specifically into her sister's hand, laughing, insisting, in a voice pitched just loud enough for their father to hear across the room and nod his approval. The smallest and most private of signals passed between two people who had rehearsed it more than once before that evening ever began. Philippa set down her pen entirely and sat very still, watching the fire, while a suspicion she did not yet want to hold began, slowly and against her own will, to take on a shape she recognized, and a name she was not yet ready to say aloud. Not even to herself, not even in a room with no one else in it to hear. She did not speak the suspicion aloud for 3 more days, not to Nathaniel, not to Mrs. Chegwin, not even to the empty room when she was alone in it, and might have said anything she liked to the walls without fear of being overheard. She turned it instead, the way she turned every difficult thing now, into a column to be balanced. On one side she set what she knew for certain, that Henrietta had chosen the glass, that Henrietta had chosen the moment, that Henrietta's grief in the days following had never once produced an actual tear, only the theater of one, performed with a precision that a girl overcome by genuine sorrow for her ruined sister would not have had the composure to manage. On the other side she set what she wished, quite badly, to still believe, that her own sister, whatever her vanities and her small cruelties, could not have looked her in the eye across a crowded room and handed her a drugged glass with a laugh on her lips. The column would not balance. It had not balanced from the moment she first set the figures down, and by the 4th morning, Philippa understood that she had already known the answer before she allowed herself to ask the question, in the same way one knows, stepping onto a familiar stair in the dark, exactly which board is going to creak before the sound arrives. Henrietta had done it, not merely permitted it, not merely stood by while their father arranged it, but placed the glass in her own sister's hand and watched her drink it down. Knowing a thing and proving it, Philippa reminded herself, were not the same exercise, and she had been raised, whatever else her father had failed to teach her, on the difference between the two. A suspicion, however certain, could not be laid before a magistrate, nor even before a husband, who had already shown her more patience than she had any right to expect. What she needed was not conviction. She had that already, cold and complete, sitting in her chest like a stone she had swallowed and could not bring back up. What she needed was evidence, and evidence she had learnt long before she had ever needed to learn anything of the kind, lived in paper, not in memory. She thought often, in those 4 days, of the particular way her father had looked at her across the aisle of the church at her wedding, as though relief and calculation could occupy the same face without either one troubling the other, and she found herself wondering, for the first time, whether the marriage he had arranged for her so quickly, after the scandal, had been intended purely as a punishment, or whether it had also served some second purpose she had not yet uncovered. Sir Josiah did nothing, in her long experience of him, that served only a single end. He had married her off to a duke who wanted shore rights he happened to own. He had done it within 3 months of a scandal that happened to strip her, on paper at least, of any claim to the fortune her mother had left behind. 2 conveniences arriving together so neatly that Philippa had begun to distrust the word convenient entirely. It was this thought, more than any other, that carried her back at last to a name she had been avoiding, for reasons she did not entirely wish to examine. Her grandfather, Edward Retillac, had been a solicitor in Truro for nearly 50 years before age, and failing eyesight had persuaded him to hand the greater part of his practice to younger men, and Philippa had not seen him in the flesh since the winter after her mother's funeral, 6 years before, when grief had made every room in his house feel too full of her mother's absence for either of them to sit comfortably in it together. She had written to him twice since her marriage, brief, careful letters that said little of substance and asked nothing of him at all, and had received no reply to either. She had told herself at the time that an old man's silence meant nothing more sinister than an old man's failing correspondence. She no longer believed that quite so easily. She raised the matter with Nathaniel over breakfast on a gray Tuesday in the middle of September, choosing her words with the same care she had begun to bring to every conversation in this house. "I should like to call upon my grandfather in Truro," she said, "if it would not inconvenience the household to spare a carriage for the day." Nathaniel looked up from his correspondence with an expression she was learning to read as mild surprise, quickly folded away beneath something more neutral. "You have not mentioned him before. We have not spoken in some years," she said. I find I should like to remedy that, now that I have the leisure for it." He did not ask her why now, of all the weeks since her wedding, she had settled upon this particular Tuesday to remedy a 6-year silence, and she was grateful for his restraint, because she was not certain, herself, that she could have given him an honest answer without also giving him rather more than she was yet ready to hand over. He arranged for the carriage without further comment, and for Sarah, the quiet, capable young woman who had lately been assigned to her as lady's maid, to accompany her for propriety's sake, and by 9 the following morning, Philippa was rattling along the coast road toward Truro, with a basket of Mrs. Chegwin's seed cake on the seat beside her, intended, the housekeeper had insisted, for an old man who very likely was not eating properly on his own. Truro, when they reached it, was a town of narrow streets and tall gray houses climbing the hill above the river, church spires crowding a skyline still busy with the ordinary business of a market day, cattle lowing somewhere behind the coinage hall, and the smell of tin smoke drifting down from the works along the water. Carts loaded with china clay rattled past them on the approach to the town, and a group of ball maidens in their stained aprons crossed the street ahead of the carriage, laughing at some shared joke that had nothing to do with the two grave. Silent women riding past them in a duke's own carriage. Philippa watched them go with a small, unexpected pang of envy for the ordinariness of their mourning. Edward Retallack's house stood on a quiet street above the cathedral, a modest, comfortable building with ivy grown thick across one wall and a brass plate beside the door, worn nearly smooth by 50 years of hands, that still announced him a solicitor, though he had long since ceased to take on new clients. He opened the door himself, which surprised her, a stooped, white-haired man with her mother's own eyes, set into a face gone soft and lined with age, and for a long moment he simply stood in the doorway, looking at her as though she were a ghost he had not quite prepared himself to receive. "Philippa," he said at last, and his voice cracked slightly on the second syllable of her name. "I had begun to think your father meant to keep you from me entirely." "He very nearly has," she said and found, standing there on his doorstep with the September wind pulling at her bonnet, that she meant it rather more literally than she had intended to say aloud. He drew her inside at once, into a house that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, and the particular dust of rooms where nothing had been rearranged in a very long time, and sat her down in a parlor crowded with books, stacked 2 deep on every shelf, and called for tea with a briskness that suggested he had not had proper company in his own house for some considerable while. A miniature of her mother hung above the mantel, painted young, perhaps 18, with the same grave, watchful eyes Philippa had inherited and had never quite known what to do with, in company that preferred a softer sort of prettiness. She found she could not look at it for very long. He asked after her marriage with careful, old-fashioned courtesy, and did not press when her answers remained brief and general, and it was not until the tea had gone lukewarm in its cups, and Sarah had been sent through to the kitchen to keep the housekeeper company, that he set down his own cup, folded his hands upon his knee, and looked at her with an expression that was no longer merely fond. "You did not come all this way for an old man's company, Philippa," he said. "What is it you have come to ask me?" She had rehearsed on the long drive from Nanscowen several careful ways of approaching the subject, and abandoned every one of them the moment she was actually seated across from him. "Grandfather," she said, "do you still hold the papers relating to Mother's settlement, the one she made for Henrietta and myself, before I was even old enough to understand what a settlement was?" Something moved behind the old man's eyes, quick and wary, gone almost before she could name it. "I do," he said carefully. "Why do you ask me that particular question, of all the questions you might have carried here?" "Because I think," she said, and made herself say it plainly, "having come this far, I think someone in my family may be trying very hard to ensure I never ask it." For a long moment Edward Retallack said nothing at all. He rose instead, with the slow deliberation of a man whose joints no longer forgave sudden movement, and crossed to a tall cabinet in the corner of the room, and stood before it with one hand resting on its locked door, as though weighing, even now, how much of what lay inside he was prepared to hand over to a girl he had not properly spoken with in 6 years. "Your mother," he said, at last without turning round, "was not a fool, Philippa. whatever your father chose to believe of her. She came to me 16 years ago, not long after Henrietta was born, and told me she wished to settle a portion of her own inheritance, the part that had come to her through me and not through your father's family at all, in trust for her two daughters, worded in such a way that no husband, present or future, could ever lay easy hands upon it. I thought it excessive caution at the time. I have had a good many years since to wonder whether it was caution enough. He returned to his chair and lowered himself into it slowly, and for the first time since she had arrived, Philippa saw the solicitor in him rise up through the grandfather, a certain formality settling over his shoulders like a coat put back on after long disuse. The deed was drawn in the year 620, he said. It names two trustees, myself and the Reverend Mr. Angwin, who held the living at Porthgullo in those days, and was, whatever his failings in the pulpit, a scrupulously honest man with a pen. Its purpose is precisely what your mother wished it to be. The income is settled upon you and your sister in equal shares, held entirely to your separate use under the rules of equity, safe from any husband's creditors or any husband's temper, come what may. There is, I will not pretend otherwise, a forfeiture clause within it. Your mother insisted upon one, to satisfy your father's vanity as much as anything, some provision by which a daughter's share might pass to the other in the event of sufficiently grave disgrace. But she was exceedingly careful, Philippa, in how that clause was worded, and I helped her word it myself, precisely because she did not trust the world to judge a daughter's disgrace fairly. What did she require? Philippa asked, that the world could not simply decide for itself. A conviction, her grandfather said. Nothing less than a conviction for an indictable offense before any court of competent jurisdiction. Gossip will not touch it. A ruined reputation will not touch it. Even your father's own displeasure, however loudly voiced, will not touch it. Only the law itself, sitting in judgment, may move a farthing of that money from one sister to the other. Philippa sat very still, turning the words over, and found that some knot she had been carrying, without quite naming it, since the morning she woke in a strange bed at the Kestrel Inn, had loosened by half a turn. Then nothing has yet been lost, she said. Not upon the terms your mother wrote. No, Riedelac said, and something careful entered his voice again. But I will confess to you, Philippa, since you have come this far to ask me plain questions, that I have had cause these past 2 years to wonder how faithfully those terms have been kept. Reverend Angwin died in the year 40. Mr. Pascoe, who was my own clerk once, a good enough young man though perhaps too anxious to please, was appointed in his place alongside myself, as the deed's own succession clause required. I do not see the accounts as often as I once did. My eyes are not what they were, and your father has never once, in 2 years, invited me to Cairo to review them in person, though I have written twice to ask it. May I see it, Philippa said. The settlement itself. He turned to look at her then, and something in his face had gone very old and very careful all at once. I sent you a copy of the material terms myself, he said slowly, 3 months past, not long after news of your marriage reached me. A short letter, nothing more, explaining the essentials in case your husband's own solicitors had occasion to ask. I addressed it to you at Nanscowen directly, and paid the carriage myself, and I confess I have wondered a little, these 3 months, why you never wrote back to acknowledge it. The room went very quiet. I never received it, Philippa said. Her grandfather's face, already pale with age, went paler still, and in the silence that followed, Philippa understood, with the same cold, complete certainty that had settled over her 4 mornings before in the library at Nanscowen, that she had just found the first hard proof of something she had, until this moment, only been permitted to suspect. Someone at Cairo, she said slowly, is reading letters that are not addressed to them, or preventing them from ever reaching their address at all, her grandfather said, and his hand had come up unconsciously to press against his chest, the gesture of a man twice her age, discovering that his own carefully worded caution had perhaps not been careful enough. I ought to have called upon you myself, rather than trust the post. I am an old fool, Philippa, and I have been an old fool for rather longer than is comfortable to admit. You are not the fool in this house, she said, and found she meant it with a fierceness that surprised her. Whatever has been done, it was not done by you. He rose again, more slowly this time. and unlocked the cabinet at last, and drew from it a slim folder of papers tied with faded green ribbon that he pressed into her hands with a care that suggested he had been waiting a very long while for someone to finally ask him to hand it over. "Take this copy yourself this time," he said. "Do not trust it to any carriage or any post rider you have not watched depart with your own eyes. And write to Mr. Pascoe directly, Philippa, as is entirely your right under the deed's own terms. Tell him you are now apprised of the settlement and expect, from this day forward, to be shown the accounts as they stand, in full, whenever you ask it of him. A trustee who has grown too accustomed to answering only to your father may find the habit inconvenient to break, but break it he must, and the sooner the better." "I will," she said, folding the papers carefully into the reticule at her side. "And Philippa," he added, as she rose to take her leave, one hand resting briefly on her sleeve in the same gesture she remembered from childhood, when he had walked her once round the cathedral green and named every gargoyle for her twice over until she had them all by heart. "Whatever it is you have begun to suspect of your family, do not carry it alone a moment longer than you must. You have a husband now, whatever the terms of that arrangement began as. Use him." She did not answer that directly, only pressed his hand in both of hers and promised to write, and to come again before the year was out, and meant both promises entirely as she made them. The drive back to Nanscowen took most of the afternoon, the coast road climbing and falling between gray stone walls and wind-bent hedges, and Philippa spent most of it with the folder of papers unopened upon her lap, one hand resting flat against the ribbon, as though she might, by touch alone, absorb whatever certainty lay folded inside it, before she had properly nerved herself to read a single line. Sarah, sensing perhaps that her mistress required silence rather than conversation, occupied herself with her needlework and said nothing at all, for the better part of 2 hours, and Philippa was grateful for it in a way she did not know how to express aloud. By the time the towers of Nanscowen came into view against the last gray light of the afternoon, she had reached only one firm decision, turned over and confirmed a dozen times across the length of the journey, until it had hardened into something she no longer felt any inclination to question. Whatever her father and her sister had built between them, brick by careful brick, over the better part of a year, it had been built on the assumption that she would never think to look behind it. They had not reckoned on a mother who had spent 16 years preparing her daughter, quietly and patiently, and without ever once explaining why, to do exactly that. She thought, watching the familiar hedgerows give way at last to the long drive up toward the house, that she owed her mother rather more than she had ever properly understood, while the woman was still alive to be thanked for it. It was a strange, belated sort of gratitude, arriving 6 years too late for its object to hear it, but Philippa found, turning the thought over one final time as the carriage slowed before the steps, that she intended to carry it with her regardless, into whatever room it was next required. Nathaniel was waiting on the steps himself when the carriage drew up, an unusual courtesy she had not expected of him at that hour, and something in her face as she descended must have told him a great deal before she had spoken a single word of it, because he did not press her, that evening, to explain herself before she was ready. He simply offered his arm and walked with her into the house, and asked only, once the fire was lit and the door was closed, whether the visit had given her what she had gone looking for. She told him a little of it that night, the letter that had never arrived, the old man's evident distress, and found, watching his face as he listened, that she was not yet ready to hand over the whole of it, only enough to explain the shadow that had followed her home. She wrote to Mr. Ambrose Pascoe the following morning, before her courage could cool along with the tea, a letter no longer than her grandfather had advised, stating plainly that she was now apprised of the terms of her mother's settlement and wished, as was her right under the deed, to review the accounts of the trust at his earliest convenience. His reply arrived 4 days later, longer than she had expected and considerably more apologetic in tone, and told her a good deal more than its careful sentences seemed to intend. He would be honored to receive her grace at his office in Truro, at whatever hour suited her, he wrote, though he trusted she would understand that certain of the accounts were, at present, somewhat behind in their reconciliation, owing to the press of others and he hoped she would extend him the customary courtesy of a little patience while matters were brought fully up to date before her inspection. He remained in the closing lines, her most obedient and humble servant, in a hand that grew noticeably less steady across the final sentence, as though the pen itself had begun to share its writer's unease. Philippa read the letter twice, and then a third time, standing by the window of her own sitting room, with the September light falling gray across the page, and found that the word behind sat in her mind rather longer than the rest of the sentence around it. A man confident in his own accounts did not ask for patience before showing them to their rightful owner. A man confident in his own accounts simply showed them and let the figures speak for themselves. She waited a further 4 days before raising the matter with Nathaniel, turning the letter over in her mind each morning during their hour with the ledgers, weighing how much of her own growing unease she was prepared to hand over before she had anything firmer than a single uneasy word to justify it. She had grown, over the months of her marriage, accustomed to a particular kind of privacy in her own suspicions, holding them close until they had proven themselves worth the sharing, and it cost her something, still, to set that habit aside. She told Nathaniel that evening, over a dinner neither of them had eaten much of, that she intended to call upon her trustee the following week, and something in the flat, deliberate way, she said it must have carried further than she meant it to, because he set down his own fork and studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "You have found something," he said. It was not a question. "I have found the shape of something," she said. "I have not yet found the thing itself." He did not press her to say more that night, and she was grateful for it, because she was not yet certain herself how much of the shape she had glimpsed was fear and how much of it was fact, and she had learnt, watching her father conduct half his life on the strength of confident assertion alone, to distrust anyone, herself included, who spoke with more certainty than their evidence had earned them. Ambrose Pascoe's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow house on a street not far from Rittalac's own, a room-lined floor to ceiling with deed boxes and ledgers bound in cracked leather, the air thick with the smell of dust and sealing wax, and the particular staleness of windows that were rarely opened even in fine weather. Pascoe himself proved to be a slight, anxious man of 45, with ink stains permanently worked into the sides of 2 fingers, and a habit of glancing at the door whenever it was not entirely necessary to do so, as though he expected, at any moment, to be interrupted by someone he would rather not see. He received her with a formality that bordered on nervousness, seated her in the room's single comfortable chair, apologized twice for the state of his shelves, though nothing about them appeared disordered, and produced, after some considerable shuffling, a bound ledger that he set upon the desk between them with the particular care of a man handling something he did not wholly trust not to explode. "I had the pleasure of knowing your grandfather rather well in my articled years," Pascoe offered, by way of easing into the business at hand. "A finer solicitor Cornwall has not seen in my lifetime, and I have tried, in my own small way, to keep his standards, though I confess the practice has grown a good deal larger than either of us anticipated when I first took it on." Philippa said only that she was glad to hear it, and did not yet say the rest of what she was thinking, which was that a man who invoked another man's good name so readily, before any question had even been asked of him, was very often a man bracing himself for a question he did not wish to answer. The trust income itself, when she came to examine it, appeared on its face, entirely in order. Rents from the small parcel of land in Gwenap her mother's family had once held, invested carefully in the funds these past 2 decades, paid out twice yearly in equal portions to 2 accounts, one nominally hers, one nominally Henrietta's, exactly as the deed required. Philippa went through the columns with the same patient attention she had learnt from her mornings over Nathaniel's own ledgers, checking each entry against the one before it, cross-referencing the interest received against the published rates for the quarter, and found, after the better part of an hour, nothing whatsoever to fault in the arithmetic itself. It was Pascoe's own hands that told her more than his ledger did. He fidgeted with his pen throughout her examination, uncapping and capping it in a rhythm that had nothing to do with any actual need to write, and twice, when the office door rattled in a gust of wind from the street, he came half out of his chair before catching himself. Once, When the church clock outside struck the half hour, he started so visibly that his own inkwell nearly went over, and caught it only by a fortunate lunge that left a smear of black across two of his fingers he did not seem to notice for some time afterward. "You seem unsettled, Mr. Pasco," Philippa said at last, closing the ledger gently. "Is there something further you wish to tell me?" The question seemed to catch him entirely off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and in the small confusion that followed, reached for the wrong ledger from the stack at his elbow, a slimmer volume bound in gray rather than brown, and had it half open upon the desk before he saw his own error and moved too quickly to close it again. But Philippa had already seen the heading at the top of the open page: Porthgullo and District Union, Accounts of the Board of Guardians. And beneath it, in a column she had only half a moment to study before Pasco's hand covered the page completely, a name she knew rather better than any figure written beside it. Sir Josiah Trewartha, the entry read, against a sum that made Philippa's breath catch somewhere behind her ribs. "Advance to be repaid, Mr. Pasco," she said very quietly. "Is my father a guardian of the parish poor rate?" Pasco had gone the color of old parchment. "Your Grace, I really must ask you to forget entirely what you have just glimpsed. It is no business of the settlement, no business of yours at all, strictly speaking, and I have no authority whatsoever to discuss the union's accounts with any person outside the board itself." "Is my father a guardian?" she said again, in the same quiet voice, and did not move from her chair. "He is chairman of the board," Pasco said at last, the words coming out of him in a rush, as though he had been holding them in his mouth for a very long time, and the dam had simply given way all at once. "Has been these 6 years. I keep the union's books alongside my own practice, as my predecessor did before me, and as his predecessor did before that. It is customary work for a solicitor in a town this size, and I assure you, Your Grace, that every entry in that ledger is accounted for in its proper season." "Advance to be repaid," Philippa said. "What manner of guardian advances himself money from a fund meant for the parish poor?" "A guardian who intends to repay it in full before any harm is done," Pasco said, and had the grace, at least, to look thoroughly wretched as he said it. "Your father has explained the matter to me himself, Your Grace, more than once. A difficulty with certain investments some years back in the mining interest, a call upon his shares that came at an inconvenient season, nothing more sinister than any gentleman of business might encounter. He borrowed against the union's reserve to meet it, as chairman, with every intention of restoring the sum before it was ever missed. And has he restored it?" Pasco's silence answered the question rather more thoroughly than any word could have. He busied himself instead with straightening the corner of the gray ledger, aligning it precisely with the edge of the desk, a small, useless task that gave his hand something to occupy while his face composed itself into something nearer its earlier calm. Outside, a costermonger's cart rattled past over the cobbles, and somewhere further down the street, a dog began to bark at nothing in particular, and Philippa waded through both small intrusions without moving, without speaking, letting the silence in the room do the work she had learnt. Over the past months, silence generally did rather better than any question she could ask aloud. "When is the fund audited?" Philippa asked. "The commissioners in London do require some manner of inspection, do they not, for a union of this size?" "Each June," Pasco said miserably. "The commissioners send an inspector down from London to review the guardian's accounts against the rate books, to satisfy themselves that the parish poor have not been shortchanged of what is properly theirs. It has always passed without incident, Your Grace, in all the years I have kept these particular books. Your father has always found some means, before the inspector's visit, of restoring what had been borrowed, a favorable turn in the ore price, some manner of relief that answered before the difficulty could ever be discovered by anyone with cause to look too closely." "And this year," Philippa said. Pasco did not answer at once. When he did, his voice had dropped nearly to a whisper, as though the walls of his own office might carry the words somewhere he did not wish them to travel. "This year the sum outstanding is a good deal larger than it has ever been before," he said. "The mine your father invested in called for capital twice this past 12-month rather than once, and I do not believe, from what little he has confided in me, that he presently has the means to make the Union whole again before June arrives. I have urged him, Your Grace, more than once, to find some other course. He has told me each time that he has a plan already in motion that will settle the matter entirely, and has bid me hold my tongue and my patience a little longer. Philippa sat very still in the uncomfortable chair and felt something settle into place in her mind with the same cold, complete click she had felt in her grandfather's parlor 4 days before, only larger this time, and considerably more dangerous. A plan already in motion, she repeated slowly. Mr. Pascoe, when precisely did my father first begin speaking to you of this plan? Pascoe's eyes came up to hers, and something in his anxious, ink-stained face shifted, as though he were only now, in this moment, beginning to see the shape of the question she was actually asking him. Sometime this spring, he said slowly. Not long, now that you press me to recall it, before your own marriage was arranged. Neither of them said anything further for a long moment. Outside in the street, a cart rattled past over the cobbles, and somewhere further off a church bell began, unhurried, to mark the hour. I do not ask you to betray your duty to the board, Philippa said at last, choosing her words with great care. But I will ask you this, Mr. Pascoe, and I hope you will consider very carefully before you answer it. My mother named you trustee of a settlement she built, specifically to protect her daughters from exactly this sort of difficulty. If my father has begun to view that settlement, or any part of it, as a means of covering a debt of his own making, do you not think it falls rather squarely within your duty to tell me so? Pascoe was quiet for a long moment, turning his pen over and over between ink-stained fingers, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier nervousness altogether, replaced by something more like genuine unhappiness. I do not know what your father intends, Your Grace, he said. I have not been shown the whole of it, only asked, more than once these past months, whether the forfeiture provision in your mother's settlement might reasonably be understood to extend beyond a formal conviction, in circumstances of sufficiently grave and well-attested disgrace. I told him, each time he asked it, that the deed's own wording was entirely plain on the point, and admitted of no such extension. He did not appear to find my answer to his liking. The room seemed for a moment to go very quiet around her. Thank you, Mr. Pascoe, Philippa said, rising from her chair, with a steadiness she did not wholly feel. You have told me a great deal more than you perhaps intended to, and I promise you I will not forget the courage it cost you to say it. She walked out into the street afterward, rather than calling immediately for the carriage, needing a few minutes of ordinary noise and ordinary weather before she trusted herself to sit still in a moving box with nothing to occupy her hands but her own racing thoughts. Truro went about its business around her, quite unaware of what had just been said in the small office behind her, carters shouting to one another over the rattle of wheels, a woman selling pilchards from a basket, calling her wares in a sing-song voice that carried the length of the street, and Philippa walked the length of 2 blocks and back again, breathing the cold September air, before she felt composed enough to signal for Sarah and the waiting carriage. She rode back to Nanscowen that evening, with the trust ledger's clean columns of figures quite forgotten, turning instead the single sentence that would not leave her, a debt her father could not repay, a fund he had already begun asking his own solicitor to bend, and a marriage arranged for her, 3 months after her ruin was manufactured, to a man who happened to want the one thing her father still had left to sell. That night, for the first time since her wedding, she told Nathaniel everything, seated across from him in the library, with the fire burnt low and the whole house asleep around them, and when she had finished, he was quiet for a long while, staring into the embers with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Your father is drowning, he said at last, and means to use you as the plank that saves him. Yes, Philippa said. Then we had better find out, he said, before he manages it, exactly how deep the water runs. She considered the fire for a long moment before she answered him, turning over, as she had turned over so many things these past weeks, exactly how much further she was prepared to let this go before the danger of it outweighed the sense. There is still Vosper, she said finally. Whatever my father intends, whatever Henrietta did or did not know of the whole design, Aubrey Vosper was in that room. He signed nothing, said nothing publicly beyond what was required of him, and has been permitted, so far as I am aware, to go on living exactly as he pleases in the meanwhile, unmolested by any consequence at all. A man who was merely frightened into silence might yet be frightened into speaking, if the fright were pointed in the right direction. Nathaniel studied her across the low fire, and something that might almost have been approval moved behind his eyes. "You mean to call on him yourself?" "I mean to write to him myself," she said. "And when he does not answer, which I expect he will not, I mean to call on him myself. He owes me an accounting rather more than my father's solicitor does, and I find I have grown considerably less patient than I was 3 months ago about waiting for accountings to be offered freely." "Then I will come with you," Nathaniel said, "when the time comes," though something in his tone made it plain the offer was made as escort rather than command, and he did not press her further when she inclined her head to accept it without argument. "Whatever else the man deserves, he does not deserve to be alone in a room with you again." She thought, as she climbed the stairs to her own locked door some while later, that it was the first time in a very long while that the prospect of confronting one of the people who had ruined her had felt less like fear, and rather more, cautiously, like the beginning of an accounting long overdue. Winter settled over Nanscowen in the way it settled over most of that coast, not with snow, which the sea rarely allowed, but with a gray, persistent damp that crept into every room, regardless of how many fires Mrs. Chegwin kept burning, and a wind off the water that rattled the old casements each night, until Philippa had grown almost fond of the sound, the way one grows fond of any company that never fails to arrive. She wrote to Aubrey Vosper in the second week of December, a short letter, carefully worded, asking only that he do her the courtesy of a meeting to discuss matters concerning the previous April. She did not threaten him in it, not openly. She had learnt enough by then of how threats traveled among frightened men to know that the clearest ones were rarely the ones written down. He did not answer, not that month nor the next. By the third week of January, with no reply forthcoming and her own patience worn considerably thinner than it had been, in December, Philippa had Nathaniel's steward make discreet inquiry as to Mr. Vosper's present situation, and learnt that the gentleman in question had taken rooms above a coaching inn on the outskirts of Truro, having apparently found it prudent, in recent months, to remove himself from whatever society had once been willing to receive him. He owed money, the steward reported, to nearly everyone in the town who might reasonably be owed money by a gentleman of no fixed income and fewer prospects, and had not been seen at his former lodgings, nor at any card table of consequence, since shortly after the previous autumn. "A man in that condition," Nathaniel observed when she brought him the report, "is a man who has run out of places to hide from the people he actually fears. Then we shall be the first thing he has had cause to fear." "In some while," Philippa said, and began, that same evening, to plan exactly what she meant to say to him. They traveled to Truro on a raw morning, at the end of January, the sky the color of an old coin, and the wind sharp enough off the water to sting the eyes. The road climbed and dropped between bare hedgerows, scoured colorless by months of salt wind, and Philippa spent most of the journey rehearsing, silently, the precise order in which she meant to lay her words before a man she had never once, in her life, exchanged so much as a greeting with, and yet whose name had shadowed the whole of the past 10 months of her life more thoroughly than her own father's had. "I have thought," she said aloud, somewhere past the halfway point of the drive, breaking a silence that had settled comfortably between them, "that I ought to feel more afraid of this than I do." Nathaniel, seated across from her with his hat balanced on his knee, considered the question with the same unhurried care he brought to most things. "Perhaps fear requires uncertainty," he said. "You have not been uncertain of very much these past months." "I have been uncertain of a great deal," she said. "Of the facts, perhaps," he allowed. "Never, that I have observed, of what you meant to do about them once you had them." She found, turning the observation over for the remainder of the drive, that she did not entirely know how to answer it, and found herself thinking, instead, of the version of herself who had climbed into a different carriage on a rain-soaked afternoon 6 months before, silent and gloveless, and entirely certain that the whole of her future had already been decided by other hands than her own. That woman would not have recognized the one sitting here now, composing her arguments for a confrontation of her own choosing, and Philippa found she did not miss her very much at all. She was still turning it over when the coaching inn came into view at the edge of the town, its yard busy with ostlers and steaming horseflesh, and the moment for answering had passed. They found Aubrey Vosper's lodgings above the inn to be a single cramped room smelling of damp plaster and last night's tallow, its occupant unshaven and visibly startled to find a duke and duchess standing in his doorway where he had evidently expected, from the hesitant knock, nothing more alarming than his landlady come to press him again for the week's rent. "Your Grace," he managed, backing a step into the room, his eyes moving rapidly between the two of them as though calculating, even in his surprise, which one of them represented the greater danger. "I confess I had not expected the honor." "You had my letter," Philippa said, stepping past him into the room without waiting to be invited, and did not think it worth the honor of a reply. "I did not know what there was to say," he said, and something in the way he said it, a thin, unhappy honesty threaded through the evasion, told her more than any prepared denial could have. "Then allow me to help you find something," Philippa said, and seated herself, uninvited, in the room's single chair, while Nathaniel remained standing near the door, arms folded, saying nothing at all. A silent wait in the small room that Vosper's eyes kept returning to despite himself. Vosper's gaze moved once, involuntarily, toward the window, as though he were measuring, even now, the distance to some exit that did not exist in a room 3 floors above a coaching yard, and Philippa watched the small, hunted motion with something that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction, but sat uncomfortably, somewhere near enough to both. "I will not waste your morning nor my own," she began. "I know what was done to me at the Kestrel Inn last April, Mr. Vosper, and I have a fair notion by now of who arranged it and why. What I do not yet have, and what I have come here this morning to obtain, is your own account of the part you played in it, set down and signed in your own hand." Vosper's face had gone the color of old wax. "I have nothing to say to that, Your Grace. I hardly recall the particulars of that evening at all." "You recall them perfectly well," Philippa said. "A man does not forget the morning he wakes to find himself accused, by 3 witnesses arranged with suspicious promptness, of an act he has no actual memory of committing. You were used that night every bit as much as I was, Mr. Vosper, only you were paid for the privilege, and I rather suspect the payment has not stretched nearly so far as you had hoped it would. Given the state of these rooms and the debts my husband's steward tells me you have accumulated in every corner of this town." Something flickered behind Vosper's eyes, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it, the particular alertness of a drowning man who has just glimpsed, for the first time, a rope rather than merely more water. "You are aware," Philippa continued, before he could speak, "of the Act of Parliament passed some 6 years since, concerning offenses against the person. It makes felony of administering any stupefying drug to any person, with intent thereby to enable the commission of an indictable offense upon them. Whether that offense was the theft of my reputation, or something graver still that I have not yet fully uncovered, is a question I expect a court at Bodmin would be rather interested to examine in detail, and a jury drawn from decent men of this county rather less inclined than you might hope to extend much sympathy to whoever is finally found to have held the glass." "I did not hold the glass," Vosper said quickly. "I swear to you, Your Grace, upon whatever you like, I never touched what was given you that night. I was paid only to be present, to be found in a state that would not contradict whatever story was told of the room." "Paid by whom?" Vosper hesitated, his eyes flicking once more to Nathaniel's silent, watchful figure by the door, and something in that hesitation told Philippa she had very nearly reached the bottom of what little resistance the man had left in him. "Your father approached me himself in the first instance," he said at last, "in March at a card room off Boscawen Street, over a hand of whist. He knew I was pressed for funds, everyone in the town knew it by then, and he made me an offer that seems at the time considerably less dreadful than it has since come to feel. 200, to be present at a certain place on a certain evening, and to say nothing afterward, whatever tale was told of what had occurred there. I did not know, Your Grace, I give you my word I did not know, that you were to be drugged for the purpose. I believed, fool that I was, that some manner of compromising situation had already been arranged between yourself and another party, and that I was merely to be a witness lending it credibility. I did not learn the truth of how you came to be in that bed until I woke beside you myself, as startled and as sickened by the sight of you as anyone who burst through that door a moment later. Who brought me to the room? Philippa asked. I did not walk there myself. I remember nothing between the supper room at Cairo and waking at the inn. 2 men hired for the purpose, Vosper said. I did not know their names, nor did I ask. But it was your sister, your Grace, who saw the whole thing arranged from the first, who told me exactly when to arrive, and exactly how to be found, and who stood in the passage outside the room herself, not 10 minutes before the door was broken open, to be sure everything was just as it ought to appear. The room was very quiet for a moment. Somewhere below, in the yard of the inn, a horse stamped and a groom called out something indistinct. And the 200, Philippa said at last. Where did my father find such a sum, in ready money, on short notice? He is not, by every account I have gathered since, a man with 200 to spare on anything at all. Vosper's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. That is a question I have asked myself rather more than once these past months, Your Grace, since the debt collectors began calling at my own door, with considerably less patience than your father ever showed toward his. He paid me in a single bank draft, drawn not upon his own account at the county bank, where I understand his balance to be thin enough these days to embarrass a curate, but upon an account I did not recognize at all, held with a firm of shipping agents down at Falmouth. I thought little of it at the time. I have had considerably more leisure to think of it since, sitting in these rooms with nothing else to occupy me but my own creditors and my own conscience, in roughly equal and equally unwelcome measure. Do you recall the name of the firm? Nathaniel asked, speaking for the first time since they had entered the room, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Vosper's eyes snap toward him at once. Coswell, Vosper said, after a moment's thought, E. Coswell and Sons, I believe it was styled, upon the draft. I had cause to notice it particularly because I had heard the name before. In connection with the harbor dispute, everyone along this coast has been muttering about since the packet trade began abandoning Falmouth. I did not think at the time what a shipping agent from Falmouth could possibly want with my own small and sorry part in a family scandal, 3 parishes distant. I confess I still do not entirely understand it. Have you seen the draft itself since? Nathaniel pressed. Or only handled it that once in passing? Only the once, Vosper admitted. I was in no state to keep such things carefully, Your Grace, not that spring, with 3 separate creditors calling at my door in the same week. I spent the greater part of it within a fortnight, and thought no more of where it had come from, until debts of my own began arriving that I had no ready means left to answer. Philippa felt something cold and clarifying move through her, the particular sensation of 2 separate columns of figures, kept apart for months in different ledgers of her own mind, suddenly proving, upon comparison, to share the very same total. I believe I am beginning to, she said quietly, and reached into her reticule for the paper and traveling inkstand she had brought with her for precisely this purpose. Mr. Vosper, I am going to ask you now to set down everything you have just told me, in your own words and your own hand, and to sign it before a witness. I will not pretend to you that this costs you nothing, but I think you have discovered, in these last months of hiding from your own creditors, in a room that smells of damp plaster, precisely how little my father's 200 was ever going to be worth to you in the end. You may as well be paid this time, in something more lasting than money. A clear conscience is not nothing, Mr. Vosper, whatever else you have lost along the way to finding one. Vosper looked at the paper for a long moment, and then at Nathaniel, still and watchful by the door, and then, longest of all, at Philippa herself, seated in his one chair with a composure that had cost her, though he could not have known it, the better part of a year to build. He took up the pen. He wrote slowly and badly, his hand unsteady with cold or nerves, or perhaps both, crossing out a line twice and beginning it afresh, and Philippa sat through the best part of an hour watching him set down, in his own cramped and increasingly legible script, an account that matched, almost word for word, everything he had already told her. He signed it at last with something that looked, to her eye, almost like relief, the particular loosening of a man setting down a weight he had grown so accustomed to carrying that its absence, however welcome, still left him faintly unbalanced. Nathaniel witnessed the signature with his own, in a hand that did not waver at all, and folded the paper away into his coat with the same careful finality he had shown, months before, in folding away a marriage contract that had once seemed to both of them the whole of what this arrangement would ever amount to. "What becomes of me now?" Vosper asked as they made ready to leave, his voice smaller than it had been at any point in the interview. The voice, Philippa thought, of a man who had spent so long fearing one particular reckoning that he had not properly prepared himself for what came after it arrived. "That rather depends on you, Mr. Vos," Philippa said, pausing in the doorway. "I have no present wish to see you prosecuted for a crime you were, by your own account, more nearly a victim of than an author. But I will tell you plainly that I expect this signature to remain true wherever and whenever it is next required of you, in whatever room I next find it necessary to produce it. Should it prove otherwise, I promise you the Act of Parliament I mentioned earlier will seem, by comparison, the gentlest inconvenience you have yet faced this winter." She did not wait for his answer. She was already halfway down the narrow stair, the folded confession safe in Nathaniel's breast pocket, and a single name, E. Coswell and Sons, turning over and over in her mind with the particular insistence of a key that had not yet found its lock. Outside, the yard of the inn was bright and ordinary with the business of ostlers and departing coaches, and Philippa stood for a moment on the cobbles, drawing in a long breath of cold January air, feeling, for the first time since she had climbed those narrow stairs an hour before, the full weight of what had just been settled and signed above her. She had expected some triumph in it, some clean and satisfying sense of a debt finally collected. What she felt instead was something quieter and considerably less comfortable, a kind of grief for a man who had been drowning nearly as thoroughly as she had, only with none of her own reasons ever to learn how to swim. The carriage ride back toward Nanscowen passed largely in silence, though it was a different silence than the one that had carried them to Truro that morning, less an absence of words than a shared, unhurried working through of what the morning had actually handed them. "A shipping agent at Falmouth," Nathaniel said at last, "has no natural interest in a scandal 3 parishes distant, involving a family he has no obvious connection to at all, unless the scandal itself was never the true object of his interest." "Then what was?" Philippa asked, though she suspected, even as she asked it, that some part of her had already begun to guess the shape of the answer, in the same slow, unwilling way she had once guessed the shape of her sister's part in the whole affair. Nathaniel did not answer at once. He was looking out at the darkening fields, his jaw set in the particular hard line she had come to recognize as the one he wore when weighing a suspicion he did not yet wish to voice aloud, for fear of giving it more solidity than it had yet earned. "I mean to find out," he said finally, "and I think, given how thoroughly your own methods have outperformed mine at every turn since September, that you had better be the one to lead the finding." Ambrose Pascoe, when Philippa returned to his office in the second week of February, with Vosper's signed confession folded into her reticule and a single name pressed carefully into her memory, needed very little persuasion to open his own books a second time. He met her at the door himself this time, without the anxious formality of their first meeting, and she thought, watching him usher her to the same uncomfortable chair, that something in the man had shifted in the weeks since her last visit, as though the act of finally speaking one uncomfortable truth aloud had made the prospect of speaking a second one considerably less daunting than it might once have seemed. He was, she thought, watching him work through the union's ledgers, with a new and rather grim determination, a man who had spent 2 years wanting badly to be caught out of his own complicity, and had simply lacked, until now, anyone brave enough or informed enough to do the catching. It took him the better part of 2 days, sent for and reviewed a second time in her presence rather than left to his own uneasy discretion, to trace the pattern she had asked him to look for, cross-referencing bank drafts against dates, dates against correspondence, correspondence against the private ledger he had once been so anxious to hide from her altogether, and when he laid the result before her at last, spread across his desk in a fan of receipts and drafts, It told a story rather more complete than either of them had expected to find. 3 payments, Your Grace, he said, since last summer, each styled in your father's own private accounts as a consultancy fee or an advance against future freight, paid by Coswell and Sons of Falmouth into an account your father maintained separately from the union's books, an account I confess I did not know existed until I went looking for it specifically. The first payment arrived in May of last year, within a fortnight, as near as I can reckon it, of your own marriage being first proposed. The second in September. The third only last month. What manner of consultancy could my father possibly offer a firm of shipping agents? Philippa asked, though she suspected, even as she asked it, that she already knew the answer well enough not to require his confirmation. None whatsoever, Pascoe said. Your father has never in his life set foot upon a merchant vessel, nor advised upon a cargo manifest, nor done anything at all, so far as I am aware, that a shipping agent might reasonably wish to pay him for. I do not believe these payments were ever intended to purchase consultancy, Your Grace. I believe they were intended to purchase your father himself, and whatever influence he retained over matters that concerned you. Philippa sat with the receipts spread before her, and felt the last piece of a pattern she had been assembling for months slide, at last, into a shape she could name aloud. Edgar Coswell does not care in the least whether I am ruined or restored, she said slowly. He cares a great deal whether my husband builds a deep water pier at Porthgullo, because a working harbor there, drawing trade away from Falmouth's dying packet business, would compete directly with whatever trade Coswell means to capture for himself. My father's scheme against me was never his true concern. It was simply a convenient handle he found already lying to hand, and he has been paying to keep that handle turning ever since, in whatever direction serves him best. Pascoe said nothing, but the look on his face confirmed what she had already concluded well enough on her own. She rode back to Nanscowin that afternoon, with a second confession folded into her reticule alongside the first, this one written in numbers rather than words, and found Nathaniel in the library, a letter already open upon the desk before him, his face arranged into a stillness she had learnt, over the past 7 months, to read as a very particular kind of danger. I have had correspondence of my own today, he said, before she had even removed her bonnet. From Mr. Coswell himself, it would appear, delivered by your father's own hand, though the words are entirely Coswell's. He passed the letter across without further comment, and Philippa read it standing, her cloak still damp from the ride. It was a short letter, and a plain one, stripped of any pretense at courtesy. Edgar Coswell wrote that he understood. The duchy's officers were presently weighing 2 competing applications for the lease of the foreshore below Porthgullo, his own, and the Duke of Calderwood's, and that he had reason to believe the Duke's application had lately been viewed with some disfavor among certain of the duchy's officers, owing to the unfortunate scandal presently attaching itself once again to the Truertha name. He regretted the difficulty entirely, he wrote, in a line whose careful politeness made Philippa's skin prickle rather more than any open threat could have done. He would, however, be pleased to withdraw his own application in its favor, and to use what small influence he possessed, with the relevant gentleman in London, to smooth the Duke's path considerably, upon one small condition, that the Duke's household withdraw entirely from whatever inquiry it presently pursued into the settlement of the late Lady Truertha's estate, and permit that matter to resolve itself, as he delicately phrased it, according to the ordinary course of family affairs. He remained, he closed, his Grace's most obedient servant in this matter, and he trusted, in whatever profitable matters might follow it. Philippa set the letter down upon the desk, with hands that had gone very still, in the way her hands always stilled now when the ground beneath her had grown most uncertain. He is offering you the harbor, she said, in exchange for my silence. He is offering me the harbor, Nathaniel agreed, in exchange for abandoning you to your father's forgery, which amounts, I think we may both agree, to precisely the same thing stated with slightly more delicacy. What have you told him? Nothing yet, Nathaniel said. I wished you to read it first, since it concerns you rather more directly than it concerns me. But I will tell you plainly, Philippa, that there is no version of my answer that does not end with his letter refused. I did not marry you to sell you back to your father's creditors the moment the arithmetic grew inconvenient. The peer, she said quietly. Nathaniel, you have spent 10 years rebuilding this estate for the sake of that peer. Every tenant on this land is waiting on it. The whole parish will feel it, not merely you, the moment the packet trade finishes dying, and there is nowhere left for a general cargo to land within half a day's cart ride. I am aware of what it has cost me to pursue it, he said, and something in his voice had gone very level and very final. I have thought of little else for the better part of a decade. But I am also aware of what it would cost me to abandon you to keep it, and I find, Philippa, that the two costs are not, in the end, so difficult to weigh against one another as Mr. Coswell evidently believes them to be. A pier is stone and timber. It can be rebuilt elsewhere in time at some other stretch of coast, by some other means I have not yet discovered. I do not know how a man rebuilds his own conscience once he has sold a wife's protection for a lease. You have not yet lost the lease, she said. You have only refused an offer. I understand the difference, he said, and something in his eyes told her he understood, rather better than she did in that moment, exactly how thin a distinction it was likely to prove. I do not expect Coswell to take a refusal gracefully. He has shown me, in a single letter, precisely how far he is prepared to reach in pursuit of what he wants. I should be a fool to imagine he means to stop reaching simply because I have declined his first offer. He wrote his refusal that same evening, in Philippa's presence, in a hand that did not waver across a single line, brief and quite without the customary courtesies such correspondence usually observed, and sent it by his own groom to be carried to Falmouth before morning. Neither of them spoke of the matter again that night, though Philippa lay awake a long while afterward in her own locked room, listening to the wind off the water, turning over the particular weight of a decision made so plainly and so entirely, on her behalf, by a man who had married her, not 1 year before, purely as a matter of business. The summons from Pasco arrived 11 days later, in the last week of February, requesting the attendance of both her Grace and his Grace at his office, at their earliest convenience, upon a matter, he wrote, that Sir Josiah Trewartha had lately brought before him, and which touched directly upon the terms of the settlement. Philippa read the letter 3 times over breakfast, searching each careful line for some hint of how much resolve remained in the man who had written it, and found, in the end, that she could not tell, and that there was nothing to be done about the not knowing except to go and discover it for herself. They traveled to Truro together on a morning bitter with frost, the hedgerows white and stiff along the coast road, neither of them speaking a great deal, and found Pasco's small office already crowded when they arrived. Her father seated stiffly in the second chair with a folder of papers upon his knee, and beside him a lean, gray-haired stranger she did not recognize, introduced by Pasco with visible discomfort as Mr. Hendra, a solicitor come down from Bodmin at Sir Josiah's own request. Her father did not look at her as she entered. He looked instead at some fixed point on the wall above Pasco's head, his jaw set in the particular hard line she remembered from her own wedding morning, and did not so much as incline his head in greeting when Nathaniel handed her into the room's remaining chair. He had aged, she noticed, in the month since she had last stood this close to him, the flesh beneath his eyes gone gray and papery in a way that spoke of sleepless nights rather than mere advancing years, and for one unwelcome instant, she felt something almost like pity for him, before she remembered precisely what that pity would cost her if she allowed it to soften anything. She said in the next hour, "I understand there is a document you wish to bring before us, Mr. Pasco," Nathaniel said, once the small awkward business of seating everyone had been settled. Pasco cleared his throat twice before he found his voice. "Sir Josiah has presented to me," he said, "a codicil to the late Lady Trewartha's settlement of the year 620, dated the autumn of the year 630, purporting to amend the forfeiture provision contained within the original deed." "Amend it how?" Philippa asked, though she had already begun to suspect the shape of the answer. Mr. Hendra answered for him, his voice smooth and entirely untroubled. The voice, Philippa thought, of a man paid well enough not to concern himself overly with what he was being paid to argue. "The codicil extends the definition of disgrace sufficient to trigger forfeiture," he said, "from a formal conviction alone, to encompass public disgrace of a nature seriously injurious to the family's honor, as attested by 2 or more persons of good character. Her ladyship, it would appear, came in later years to share her husband's view that a formal conviction set too narrow and too easily evaded a standard to serve its intended purpose, and amended the clause accordingly, some months before her final illness. That is a lie, Philippa said, and did not trouble to soften it. His mother spent 17 years guarding that clause, specifically against the sort of manufactured disgrace my father and my sister arranged against me last April. She did not soften it in the year 36. She would never have softened it, in that year or any other, and I think you know it rather better than your own client has paid you to admit. I understand your feeling, Mr. Hendra said, with the particular unctuous patience of a man well accustomed to being told he was wrong by people considerably angrier than his fee required him to acknowledge. But the document bears her ladyship's signature, witnessed, and I am instructed that Mr. Pascoe's own predecessor in the trust, the late Reverend Angwin, also affixed his signature to it before his death some years since. And my own grandfather's signature, Philippa said. Mr. Ritalick, the deed's other named trustee, without whom no amendment could ever have been validly made in the year 36, since he and the Reverend Angwin held the office jointly at that time. Does the document bear his hand as well? A brief, uncomfortable silence answered her before Mr. Hendra found words to fill it. The codicil required, at the time of its execution, only such witnessing as satisfied the ordinary requirements of a valid amendment, he said. I am not presently in a position to speak to every detail of Mr. Ritalick's involvement. Which is to say, Philippa said it does not. Pascoe, caught between the two of them, looked, for a long moment, as though he might genuinely be ill. He drew the document itself from among his papers, turning it toward the window light with hands that were not quite steady, and studied the foot of the page for a moment before he set it down again, unable, it seemed, to quite meet Philippa's eye as he did so. Your Grace, he said at last, addressing himself to Philippa with visible misery, I have examined the document as closely as the time allowed me has permitted, and I cannot, upon the signatures alone, declare it a forgery outright. I have written to Mr. Ritalick this very week, requesting his own recollection of the matter, but he has been unwell these past days, and I have had no reply as yet. Until I do, and until I have had opportunity to examine the deed's own succession clause more thoroughly than a single afternoon has allowed me, I am obliged, as trustee, to treat the codicil as provisionally valid, and to proceed upon that basis unless and until it is properly set aside. Provisionally valid, Nathaniel repeated, his voice very quiet. Provisionally, Pascoe said, and looked as though the word cost him something considerable to say aloud. I am sorry, Your Grace. I am bound by the deed's own terms to act with reasonable diligence, not with certainty I do not yet possess, and Sir Josiah has pressed me, these past weeks, rather harder than I have felt able to resist alone. Sir Josiah, throughout this entire exchange, had said nothing at all, sitting with his hands folded upon the folder in his lap, and his eyes fixed upon that same point on the wall, and it was only as the meeting drew to its unhappy close, the papers gathered, and Mr. Hendra already rising to take his leave, that he finally spoke, his voice low and directed. Philippa understood at once, entirely at her. You ought to have left well enough alone, Philippa, he said. I gave you a duke and a house, and a name no longer stained by scandal. I do not know what more you imagined you were owed. An accounting, she said quietly. Nothing more than that, father. I have found, this past year, that I am rather better suited to keeping one than you ever gave me credit for. He did not answer her. He rose instead, gathering his hat from the corner of Pascoe's desk with hands that were not entirely steady, and followed Mr. Hendra out into the frozen street without another word, and Philippa understood, watching his stooped shoulders retreat through the small window, that whatever remained unsaid between them would stay that way now, unspoken, perhaps for good, a debt neither of them any longer had the appetite to collect in words. They rode back toward Nanscowen in a silence heavier than any that had passed between them before, the frost thickening upon the hedgerows as the light failed, and it was not until they were within sight of the house itself, its windows just beginning to show gold against the dusk, that a rider met them upon the road, one of Nathaniel's own men, sent out to intercept the carriage with a letter that had arrived that afternoon from the duchy's officers in London. Nathaniel read it by the last of the daylight, and Philippa watched his face change as he did, the particular stillness that came over him now standing in for whatever storm was moving underneath it. "The duchy has granted the foreshore lease," he said finally, folding the letter closed, "to Mr. Edgar Coswell of Falmouth, effective from the quarter day next. My own application has been declined, owing, the letter states, with a delicacy I find I have very little patience left to appreciate, to certain unresolved questions presently attaching to the applicant's family connections." Neither of them spoke again for a long moment. Below the house, just visible in the failing light, the old stone quay reached out into the dark water exactly as it always had, too shallow and too short, and would, Philippa understood now with a certainty that settled into her chest like a stone, dropped down a very deep well, remain exactly that way for as long as either of them lived to see it. "I am sorry," she said at last, because there was nothing else true enough to say. Nathaniel did not answer at once. When he did, his voice held no anger in it at all, only a tiredness that frightened her, rather more than anger would have. "Do not be," he said. "I chose it, Philippa, with my eyes entirely open, and I have not yet found a single hour, sitting in that room today, in which I would have chosen differently. But I will confess to you that I had rather hoped, in choosing it, that the choosing alone might somehow prove enough to save us both. It had not. Not that day, and Philippa, watching the last light fail over the drowned, unfinished shape of everything they had, both just lost within the space of a single frozen afternoon, did not know, for the first time since the morning she had walked into a chapel, wearing a veil to hide a bruise, whether she had any fight left in her at all. She thought, standing at the window of her own room a long while later, the fire burning low and Nanscowan's silent around her, of her mother's cabinet in Truro, and the folder of papers tied with faded green ribbon, and the particular, stubborn patience it must have taken a woman to spend 17 years guarding a daughter's future against a danger she could not have named precisely, only feared in its general shape. She had believed, walking out of her grandfather's parlor that September afternoon, that the worst her father could do to her had already been done and survived. She understood now, standing at a cold window, with a pier drowned and a codicil hanging provisionally over her own name, that she had been wrong about the shape of the worst, and that whatever came next would have to be met with something considerably steadier than the certainty that had carried her this far. She did not yet know what that something was, but she found, turning at last from the window toward the small fire, still burning in the grate, that she was not yet prepared to stop looking for it. Mrs. Chegwin brought her a cup of something hot and unasked for a little later, setting it down beside the fire without comment in precisely the manner she had brought seed cake and shawls all through the autumn before, and left again without a word, closing the door softly behind her, and Philippa found, sitting alone with the cup slowly cooling untouched at her elbow, that the small, wordless kindness of it did more to steady her that night than any argument she could have made to herself about courage or resolve. The invitation arrived at Nanscowan a week after the meeting at Pascoe's office, a thick cream card sealed with a blot of gold wax bearing the Thornbury crest, and Philippa recognized her sister's careful hand upon the direction before she had even broken the seal. Lord and Lady Thornbury requested the honor of the Duke and Duchess of Calderwood's presence at a ball to be held at their townhouse in London upon the 10th of June, to celebrate the betrothal of their son, Lord Rushford, to Miss Henrietta Trewortha. Philippa read it twice at the breakfast table, the March light thin and cold through the tall windows, and set it down beside her untouched plate with a hand that had gone very still. She thought of the last time such a card had governed the shape of her days, the wedding invitation her father had sent to half of Cornwall the previous summer, announcing a marriage arranged to solve a debt he had never once explained to either daughter, and found the echo of it, arriving now in nearly identical cream and gold, almost too neat a symmetry to be entirely coincidence. "Protocol," she said, when Nathaniel glanced up from his own correspondence, "apparently even now demands that a scandalous elder sister be invited to witness her family's triumph, provided the invitation may be safely relied upon to be declined. My father has never once in 8 months wished to see my face in a room he considered his own. He wishes it a good deal less now after the scene at Pascoe's office. And yet here it is, sent all the same, because to omit it entirely would raise questions he can even less afford to have asked, questions a Marquess's own family might begin putting to him rather more pointedly than a country solicitor ever dared. Then we shall not decline it, Nathaniel said. She looked up at him across the table and found in his face something she had not seen there since the letter from the duchy had arrived, a flicker of the same hard, purposeful light that had first made her wonder, in a rain-soaked carriage nearly a year before, which sort of man she had actually married. We have very little, at present, to bring into a room like that, she said carefully. Vosper's confession, Pascoe's discovery of the payments from Falmouth, a codicil neither of us can yet prove is false, only strongly suspect to be. It is not nothing, but I do not think it is enough, not against a document that bears my mother's own name, and a dead man's signature nobody can now dispute. Then we had better make it enough, Nathaniel said, before June arrives, and there is only one place I can think to begin. She knew, even before he said it, precisely where he meant. She wrote to her grandfather that same afternoon, and when a fortnight passed with no reply, and Pascoe's own earlier letter to him apparently still unanswered, worry overtook her caution entirely, and she traveled to Truro herself. Alone but for Sarah, arriving at the ivy-covered house above the cathedral to find Edward Retalak thinner than she remembered him, propped in a chair by his own parlor fire with a shawl about his shoulders and a look of such genuine relief upon seeing her that she felt, for one unguarded moment, entirely ashamed of how long she had let the winter keep her away. His housekeeper met her at the door with a face already lined with worry of her own, and murmured, before she had even shown Philippa through, that the master had not been eating properly in a fortnight and would not hear of sending for the physician until his own granddaughter had first been written to. A chill on the chest, nothing more, he told her, before she could properly voice her alarm, though his voice carried less conviction than his words did. I am too old to be surprised by a Cornish February any longer, and yet I persist in being surprised by it every year regardless. Pascoe wrote to me some weeks past, asking whether I recalled signing any amendment to your mother's settlement in the year 36. I have been meaning to answer him properly ever since, and have simply not had the strength some days to hold a pen steady enough for a reply that mattered. Then let me hold it for you, Philippa said, drawing a chair close beside his own, and tell me plainly, grandfather, did you sign any such document? I did not, Edward Retalak said, and something of the old solicitor's precision came back into his voice as he said it, steady and entirely without doubt. I have signed a great many papers in my life, Philippa, more than I could ever hope to recount, but I have never in my life signed anything I did not first read through in its entirety, twice over, and I certainly never signed away the very protection your mother charged me, upon her own deathbed, to guard for her daughters until I could guard it no longer. Whatever bears my name upon that codicil, it was not put there by my own hand, nor with my own knowledge or consent. Could you set that down in writing? Philippa asked. Sworn, if such a thing is required. Something a court would accept as your own true statement, rather than merely my report of this conversation. I can do rather better than that, her grandfather said, and there was, for the first time since she had entered the room, something almost like his old vigor returning to his face. Fetch me the deed box from beneath the window seat, child. I find I have rather more strength for this particular labor than I have had for any other these past 3 weeks. They spent the whole of that afternoon and most of the following morning bent together over the original settlement, Retalak's failing eyes supplementing themselves with a large glass he kept for the purpose, and Philippa's own younger ones doing the greater share of the reading aloud. Working through clause after clause of the deed her mother had commissioned 17 years before, with a care that had, Philippa understood now, anticipated a great deal, more than her mother could ever have known specifically to fear. Here, Retalak said at last, tapping one thin finger against a paragraph near the deed's close in the succession and amendment clause. Read it to me again slowly. Philippa read it aloud. Any amendment to the terms of this settlement, howsoever occasioned, shall require the joint execution and attestation of both trustees, then holding office under this deed, and shall be void and of no effect whatsoever if executed or attested by fewer than the whole number of trustees then living and competent to act. Both trustees, her grandfather said, not one living and one dead, with the dead man's hand more convenient to forge than the living one's harder to obtain. Both, Philippa, in the plainest English your mother's own solicitor could contrive for her, precisely because she foresaw, God rest her, that a single trustee grown old or careless or persuadable might one day be worth corrupting, where two, acting jointly and required to answer to one another, would prove a rather harder wall to climb. He set the deed down upon his knee and looked at her for a long moment, his eyes bright in a way that owed nothing at all to the fire. Your mother sat in this very room, Philippa, the year she had this drawn, he said. I remember it as though it were yesterday rather than 17 years distant. Henrietta was scarcely out of the nursery, and Philippa herself not much older, and she told me, plain as I am telling you now, that she did not trust your father's temper to remain steady forever, nor his judgment where money was concerned, and that she wished her daughters protected against a danger she could not yet name, only feel, the way one feels weather changing before a single cloud has shown itself on the horizon. I thought her, God forgive me, a touch fanciful that afternoon. I have had 17 years since to learn better, and I confess I am glad, whatever this winter has cost my own health, to have lived long enough to see precisely how right she was. Philippa sat back in her chair, and felt something settle over her that was not quite relief, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the particular steadiness of a woman who is finally located, after a very long search, the exact stone upon which an entire structure of lies has been built, and understood for the first time precisely how to remove it. The codicil is void, she said slowly, not merely disputed, not merely suspect, void from the moment it was executed, regardless of whatever it claims my mother intended, regardless of whether Reverend Angwin's signature upon it is genuine or forged, because it was never properly executed by both trustees in the first place, and no signature my father can produce, however convincing, will ever change that plain fact. It will not, her grandfather said. Whoever advised your father in this scheme understood the forfeiture clause well enough to attempt weakening it. They did not trouble themselves to read the succession clause with anything like the same care, and I confess I take a certain uncharitable satisfaction in that particular oversight, at my age, having so little else left to take satisfaction in these days. He wrote his statement that same evening, propped against a bank of pillows, with the deed box open beside him for reference, setting down in his own careful, if now somewhat unsteady, hand precisely what he had told her, that he had never signed nor been asked to sign any codicil to the settlement of the year 26, that the deed's own succession clause required both trustees' joint execution for any valid amendment, and that any document purporting to bear his signature upon such an amendment was, upon his oath, as a solicitor of 50 years' honest practice, no signature of his at all. He signed it, and had it witnessed by his own housekeeper and a neighboring clergyman summoned for the purpose, and pressed it into Philippa's hands the following morning, with an expression that mingled relief and something else she recognized, having worn it herself for close to a year now, as the particular satisfaction of a debt finally, properly discharged. Take it to London yourself, he told her. Do not trust the post with this one either. And Philippa, whatever room you carry it into, and whatever it costs you to carry it there, know that your mother would have been prouder of you in this moment than of anything else you might ever have done with the fortune she left you. Philippa returned to Nanscowen with her grandfather's statement folded alongside Vosper's confession, and Pascoe's tally of Coswell's payments, 3 separate pieces of a single proof, none of them sufficient entirely alone, all of them, laid together before the right witnesses, considerably harder to explain away than her father or his solicitor had evidently anticipated. The weeks that followed passed in a flurry of preparation she found, to her own quiet surprise, almost steadying in its business. Nathaniel rode ahead to secure a townhouse in Mayfair rather than his usual London hotel, and spent long hours closeted with his own solicitors, quietly arranging. Philippa gathered from the little he told her of it, for certain gentlemen of consequence, men whose good opinion Lord Thornbury's own family could ill afford to lose, to find themselves present at the ball on the 10th of June, whether the Trewortha family wished it or not. He said little of the details, and she did not press him for them, understanding well enough by now that a man who had spent 10 years quietly untangling his father's debts preferred to show his work only once it was finished, rather than while it remained half assembled. Philippa herself sent for a modiste recommended to her by, of all people, Mrs. Chegwin, whose late sister had once dressed a duchess or two in her time in London before retiring to Cornwall, and when the woman arrived at Nanscowen expecting, Philippa suspected, to clothe a chastened and grateful country wife in something suitably muted and apologetic, she found instead a duchess who tossed aside every length of pale silk offered her without a second glance. "I am not asking to be forgiven," Philippa told her, standing very straight in the fitting room with the spring light falling cool through the tall windows. "I do not require sympathy, and I have no further use for apology. I require something that commands a room the moment I enter it, and I will know it the instant you show it to me." She chose, in the end, a deep, dark blue that took the light rather than returned it, cut with a severity that had nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with armor, a high, structured neckline and long-fitted sleeves, and a train that swept the floor behind her without any need of the wide, hooped skirts, still fashionable among women who wished, Philippa thought, to take up as much room as possible without ever once being mistaken for dangerous. She wore, when the Modiste's woman came to fit her a final time, no jewels at all beyond her own wedding ring, and found, studying herself in the long glass, with her hair drawn back in a manner too severe for fashion and entirely correct for her purposes, that she recognized very little of the veiled, silent bride who had stood in a rain-soaked chapel 10 months before, and found she did not miss her in the slightest. On the morning they left for London, the last week of May, the whole of the Nanscowen household turned out upon the steps to see the carriage away. Mrs. Chegwin pressing a basket of provisions upon Sarah with the same brisk unstoppable kindness she had shown Philippa on the very first night of her marriage, and Rundle the carpenter, of all people, tipping his hat from the edge of the stable yard with a gruff nod that Philippa understood, somehow as its own particular form of good wish. Below the house, as the carriage turned onto the coast road, the old stone quay reached out into the water exactly as it always had, unfinished and unchanged. A small gray reminder of everything the past year had already cost them both, before a single word had yet been spoken in London. Philippa looked at it for a long moment through the carriage window, and found that the sight no longer struck her only as a wound. It had become, somewhere in the months since February, something closer to a debt she intended, eventually, in whatever manner circumstances eventually allowed, to find some way of repaying, though she did not yet know how, and did not trouble herself on that particular morning to pretend she did. The journey to London took the better part of 4 days, the roads improving steadily the further they traveled from Cornwall's narrower lanes, and it was somewhere on the third of those days, the carriage rattling through the flat, hedged country of Wiltshire, that Philippa finally asked Nathaniel the question she had been turning over, unspoken, since the invitation first arrived. "What if Pasco will not stand behind us?" she asked. "He has already shown us, once, how far his own courage extends when my father presses hard enough against it. If we ask him to travel to London and declare the codicil void before a room full of Lord Thornbury's own guests, and he wavers again, we shall have shown our whole hand for nothing." "Then we shall not ask him to declare anything at all," Nathaniel said. "We shall simply lay the proof before the room, your grandfather's own sworn statement, Vosper's confession, Pasco's own tally of Coswell's payments, and let 3 separate men's honesty speak for itself, in 3 separate hands, none of which your father can claim was coerced or invented for the occasion. Pasco need not find his courage that night. He need only fail to contradict what is already written and signed and impossible to unwrite. And if my father produces some 4th document we have not yet anticipated," she said, "some further forgery, some further witness paid to swear whatever he requires of them, then we shall deal with it as it comes," Nathaniel said, and something in the flat, unhurried certainty of his voice steadied her rather more than any promise of victory could have done. You have spent the better part of a year teaching me, Philippa, that the ground beneath a lie is never quite so solid as the man standing on it believes. I do not expect your father has grown any better at building on sand in the months since we last watched him try. There is a further matter, she said, more quietly. Some while later, when the flat country had given way to the first scattered outskirts of habitation that told her London could not be many hours distant now. Henrietta. Nathaniel waited, saying nothing, in the particular patient way he had learnt to wait for her, when a thought required room to find its own shape before she spoke it aloud. I do not yet know, Philippa said, what I mean to do with her, once the room has understood the whole of what she did. I have imagined this evening 100 times since February, and I find I have never once imagined it as far as that particular moment. She is my sister. She is also the person who watched me drink a drugged glass and said nothing while I woke among strangers. I do not think those two facts can be reconciled into a single feeling, and I am not certain tonight that I wish to try. You need not decide it in advance, Nathaniel said. Some things are better met as they arrive than rehearsed beforehand. I have found this past year that you generally know precisely what to say the moment a room actually requires it of you, whatever uncertainty came before. They reached London on the last day of May, the city's noise and smoke a startling assault after the long quiet of the Cornish roads, carts and hackney cabs, crowding streets far busier than anything Truro had ever shown her, the pavements thick with a press of people who none of them, so far as Philippa could tell, had ever once heard the name Trewartha spoken in scandal or otherwise. There was a strange comfort in that particular anonymity, walking a fashionable street on Nathaniel's arm and finding herself, for the first time in over a year, simply another well-dressed stranger among a great many others, unremarkable, unwatched, ordinary. She did not know how long the feeling would last, once the 10th of June arrived, but she found she was grateful for it while it did. They settled into the townhouse Nathaniel had secured in Mayfair, with 10 days still remaining before the ball. Days Philippa spent partly in quiet correspondence, confirming that her grandfather's statement had reached them safely and remained, still, exactly as sworn, and partly in a stillness she had not expected to find so difficult to sit inside, waiting, with nothing further to investigate and nothing further to prove, only the evidence already gathered and the long, slow approach of a single evening upon which everything would finally be spent. On the afternoon of the 10th of June, with the London light falling gold and ordinary through the townhouse windows, as though the day held nothing more remarkable in store for it than any other, Philippa stood once more before a long glass, while a maid fastened the final hooks of the deep blue gown, and found, studying her own reflection with a steadiness that would have astonished the veiled, silent bride of 11 months before, that she was at last entirely ready. The carriage carrying them to the Thornbury townhouse joined a long line of others crawling toward Grosvenor Square through streets already thick with the ordinary noise of a London evening, link boys calling out from every corner, the pavements bright with the spill of candlelight from a dozen windows that had nothing whatsoever to do with her own small private catastrophe, about to unfold 3 doors further along the square. Philippa sat with her hands folded in her lap, the deed box resting against Nathaniel's knee rather than her own, and found that her pulse, for all the months she had spent preparing for this particular hour, had settled into something close to stillness. "You are very quiet," Nathaniel observed, as the carriage inched forward another length. "I have said everything there is to say," she answered. "What remains is only to say it again once in the correct room." He reached across the narrow space between them and took her hand, not with any particular urgency, only a steadiness that matched her own, and held it until the carriage finally drew level with the Thornbury steps, and a footman came forward to open the door. The house blazed with 1,000 wax candles, spilling gold light onto the wet cobblestones below, and the muffled strains of a string quartet drifted out through the tall windows as they climbed the steps together. Philippa's dark blue skirts sweeping the stone behind her, Nathaniel's hand steady beneath her own. At the door the footmen recognized him at once, and bowed, and one of them, registering a heartbeat later precisely whose arm the Duke of Calderwood had brought with him, went visibly still, before recovering his composure enough to usher them through into the crowded foyer beyond. They crossed the marble floor together and began to climb the sweeping staircase toward the ballroom, and it was here, at the turn of the stair, with the major domo already drawing breath to announce them to the room beyond, that Philippa felt the whole of the past 11 months gather itself into a single point behind her ribs, sharp and entirely without fear. She knew what waited beyond those doors. She had carried the shape of this exact moment with her for a very long time now, a folded letter and a sheet of vellum tucked safe inside a gray glove, a room full of people who did not yet understand what she had come to do to their evening, a sister radiant in white silk, who believed still that the worst of it was behind her. She had simply not yet decided how slowly she meant to let it unfold. The major domo struck his staff against the floor and announced them, and the music faltered, and 200 fans stopped their slow motion at precisely the same instant, and Philippa stepped forward into the candlelight with her chin level and her sister's eyes finding hers across the crowded room for the first time in 11 months. She did not hurry. She had learnt over the course of a very long year that hurrying was a thing frightened women did, and she was no longer, whatever else remained uncertain about the evening ahead of her, a frightened woman. The crowd parted before her, without being asked to, the particular involuntary flinch of 200 people who had spent a year discussing her in whispers and had never once expected to find themselves standing quite this close to the subject of their gossip. She walked the length of the ballroom floor with Nathaniel half a pace behind her shoulder, not leading her, only guarding her flank, and ahead of her, upon the raised dais at the room's far end, stood her family arranged for its triumph. Henrietta in spun white silk and her mother's own pearls, a diamond settled at her throat. Lord Rushford beside her, tall and fair and entirely unprepared for what the evening still held in store for him. Lord and Lady Thornbury, a little apart, gracious and watchful. And at the edge of it all, Sir Josiah Trewartha, his face draining of color by degrees, as his elder daughter crossed the floor toward him with a steadiness he had evidently never once thought to prepare himself against. He broke from the group before she reached it, coming down from the dais to intercept her in the middle of the dance floor, his voice pitched low and furious. "What is the meaning of this?" he hissed. "You were not asked to come and make a scene of my daughter's betrothal." "I was invited," Philippa said, her own voice carrying rather further than his did, pitched deliberately for the benefit of the guests, already crowding close on every side. Protocol required it, did it not? I have simply chosen this once not to decline. "Get out," he said, low and vicious, "before you ruin what little remains of this family's name." "There is very little of this family's name left for me to ruin, father," she said. "You saw to that yourself in April of last year, at rather greater expense than I think you have ever properly accounted for." She stepped past him as though he were no more than an inconvenient piece of furniture, and approached the dais, where Henrietta stood with her breath coming fast, and her painted composure already beginning to crack at the edges. "Pippa," Henrietta began, her voice pitched for the sympathy of the watching room. "You are not well. You are confused. Please, sister, do not do this here." Philippa reached the foot of the dais and stopped, and reached into the small reticule at her wrist, and drew out the folded paper she had carried with her, in one form or another, for 4 months now. "I have brought you a wedding gift, Lord Rushford," she said, turning to the young man, who had gone very pale and very still beside his intended bride. "Or rather, an accounting of the fortune your intended is presently expecting to bring into your marriage. Ambrose Pascoe, summoned that morning by a note from Nathaniel and installed, at his own considerable discomfort, in a modest inn not 3 streets distant, had made his way into the ballroom some minutes before, exactly as arranged, and now stood near the edge of the crowd, with his hat still in his hands, looking as though he would very much rather have remained in Truro. Philippa found his eyes across the room, and held them for a moment, and something in her steady gaze seemed to settle him, because he came forward, at last, through the parting crowd, and stood at her side. "Mr. Pascoe is trustee of a settlement my late mother made, for my sister and myself some 17 years ago," Philippa said, her voice pitched now for the whole room to hear, not merely the family gathered upon the dais. 20,000 to each daughter, held entirely to our own separate use, safe from any husband's hand. My father has claimed, these past months, that I forfeited my own share under a codicil supposedly signed by my mother in the year 630, extending the forfeiture beyond a formal conviction to include mere public disgrace. She unfolded the first paper. This is a sworn statement from Mr. Edward Retallick, solicitor of Truro, my mother's own father, and one of the two trustees named in her original deed. He states upon his oath that he never signed any such codicil and never knew of its existence until this year. The deed itself requires the joint signature of both trustees for any valid amendment. Mr. Pascoe, you have examined that succession clause yourself. Is that not so? Every eye in the crowded room had turned now toward the solicitor, standing at her side, and Pascoe, his hands trembling faintly upon the brim of his own hat, drew a breath that seemed to steady something in him at last. "It is so, Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying further than she had ever heard it carry in his own cramped office. "The codicil requires both trustees' signature to have any effect whatsoever. Mr. Retallick's own sworn denial, which I have myself examined and find entirely credible, renders the document void from its execution. There has been no valid amendment to the settlement of the year 620. Miss Trewortha's portion has never at any point been forfeit." A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through standing corn. "Lies," Sir Josiah said, though his voice had lost by now a great deal of its earlier fury, thinning into something closer to desperation. "Fabrications, invented between the two of them to embarrass this family at the worst possible moment." Philippa unfolded the second paper. "This," she said, "is a statement given under his own hand by Mr. Aubrey Vosper, admitting that he was paid 200 by my father to be found with me at the Kestrel Inn last April, and that it was Henrietta, not any accident of my own making, who placed a drugged glass of ratafia in my hand at a supper held in this very family's honor. Henrietta made a small, strangled sound, and took a half-step backward, her hand rising to press against her own throat, as though she might physically hold the words from reaching the room. That is not true," she said, though her voice had already begun to shake apart at the edges. "Pippa hates me. She has always hated me, because I was always the one meant for something better than she ever managed for herself." "Was I meant to drown for it?" Philippa asked, very quietly, and the quiet of it carried further across the stunned room than any raised voice could have done. "Look at me and swear you did not hand me that glass, Henrietta. Swear it before Lord Rushford and his family, and every guest in this room, and I will fold these papers away and trouble your evening no further." The silence stretched and did not break, and it was Henrietta herself, at last, who broke it, her carefully maintained composure shattering all at once into something raw and ugly, and, for the first time in 11 months, entirely honest. "You were going to take it all and hide yourself away in the country," she said, her voice rising, cracking, careless now of who heard her. 20,000, wasted on a woman who never wanted a season in her life, while I was left to make do with whatever remained. I was the one who deserved a proper match. I was the one everyone always said was destined for better things. You would have squandered it on nothing at all." Lord Rushford, who had stood frozen through the whole of this exchange, finally moved, stepping back from Henrietta's side with the particular stillness of a man who has just watched an entire year's affection curdle in front of 200 witnesses. "Miss Trewortha," he said, his voice courteous and utterly final, "I believe you have just answered, rather more thoroughly than any paper could have done, every question I might otherwise have troubled myself to ask you." He turned to his own father, and something passed between them without need of words, and Lord Thornbury stepped forward with the grave authority of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to end an evening without raising his voice. "Sir Josiah," he said, "I believe this betrothal is at an end. My solicitors will be in contact with your own regarding the return of my son's ring. I will thank you not to call upon this family again." He turned and offered his arm to his wife, and the two of them withdrew from the dais, with a dignity that left Sir Josiah standing utterly alone before a room that had, within the space of perhaps 10 minutes, watched the whole of his family's carefully constructed triumph collapse into ruin. "There is a further matter," Philippa said, into the ringing silence that followed, unfolding the third and final paper she carried. "Concerning the parish poor rate of Porthgullo and district, of which my father has been chairman of the board of guardians these 6 years, and from which he has borrowed, and failed to repay, a sum considerably larger than he could presently account for, were the commissioner's inspector to call upon him before the audit due this June. Mr. Pascoe keeps those books as well. I imagine the commissioners in London will find his records rather illuminating once he furnishes them, as I have no doubt he now intends to. Pascoe, beside her, inclined his head and said nothing further, and needed to say nothing further, because the silence itself had already said everything that remained. Sir Josiah Trewartha stood alone upon the ruins of his own dais, his face gray, his hands empty, and for one long moment Philippa allowed herself simply to look at him. The man who had gripped her elbow hard enough to bruise on her own wedding morning, who had nailed the attic shutters closed against her screaming, who had spent a fortune he did not have on a scheme that had finally entirely come apart in his hands. "You ought to have left well enough alone, Philippa," he said again, the same words he had said to her in Pascoe's office in February, though they carried no threat in them now, only a kind of hollow, exhausted disbelief. "I did leave it alone, father," she said, "for nearly a year. You are the one who could not." She did not wait for his answer. She turned and took Nathaniel's offered arm, and together they walked back down the length of the ballroom floor, through a crowd that parted for them now with something closer to awe than shock, and out through the tall doors into the cool June night, leaving behind them a room that would, she understood, still be talking of this particular evening, long after every other detail of the season had faded from memory. The carriage ride back to the Mayfair townhouse passed in a silence quite unlike the one that had carried them to the ball only 2 hours before. Not tension now, but its opposite. The hush of two people who have finally set down a weight they had carried together for a very long while. "It is done," Philippa said at last, watching the gas lamp slide past the window. "It is done," Nathaniel agreed. News of the evening traveled through London with the particular speed such things always seemed to manage, and within a fortnight the whole of the Trewartha family's ruin had become the settled property of every drawing-room in the capital. Lord Rushford's family made no secret of the broken engagement, nor of the reasons behind it, and Sir Josiah, his credit exhausted and his name no longer welcome at a single respectable door in London or in Truro, retreated to Carrow Manor to await the Poor Law Commissioner's inspector, who arrived in the end rather earlier than June, summoned by a formal complaint Pascoe himself submitted within the week. What would become of him, whether the matter ended in a formal charge before the next Bodmin Assizes, or merely in his quiet, permanent removal from every office he had ever held, Philippa did not learn for some months, and found, when she finally did, that she felt a good deal less about the answer than she had once expected to feel. Henrietta did not remain at Carrow Manor beyond the summer. She was sent, Philippa heard eventually, and without any particular satisfaction in the hearing, to live with a distant cousin in the north, in circumstances considerably reduced from anything she had ever imagined for herself, and the two sisters did not correspond, then or afterward. Philippa thought of her sometimes in odd unguarded moments, standing on the dais in spun white silk with her whole carefully built future collapsing around her in the space of 10 minutes, and found that the picture no longer brought her any of the satisfaction she had once imagined it would. It brought instead a kind of tired sorrow for a sister who had never once, in all their years together, learnt that there was room enough in the world for both of them to have wanted something. Ambrose Pascoe wrote to her twice that summer, brief, careful letters that thanked her, in his own roundabout fashion, for having finally forced upon him a courage he had evidently wanted for some years to find on his own. He resigned his position as clerk to the Board of Guardians within the month, citing the press of his private practice, and Philippa suspected, reading between the careful lines of his second letter, that he had no wish whatsoever to remain in any office that might again require him to choose between his own comfort and someone else's ruin. Edgar Coswell's part in the affair, laid out in Pascoe's own careful accounting of the payments from Falmouth, found its way in time into the sort of quiet commercial gossip that mattered rather more to a man like Coswell than any court ever could. His credit grew noticeably harder to extend in the months that followed, His name a good deal less welcome among the bankers and underwriters, whose good opinion his business depended upon, though no formal charge was ever brought against him that Philippa heard of. The foreshore lease, however, remained exactly where it had been signed, in Coswell's own name, sealed for 99 years by an office that had no cause and no particular interest in unwinding an agreement lawfully made, however unlawful the scheming that had cleared its path. Nathaniel never once, in all the months that followed, suggested to her that the lease might somehow yet be recovered. He had made his choice in February, with his eyes entirely open, and he did not revisit it. And Philippa loved him, she thought, rather more for that particular steadiness than for anything else he had ever done on her behalf. They returned to Nanscowen in the last week of June, the Cornish light long and gold across the water, as the carriage came down through the last fold of hillside toward the house, and Philippa found, stepping down onto the familiar gravel with Mrs. Chegwin already hurrying out to meet them, that the old stone quay below the house still reached out into the estuary exactly as it always had, too shallow and too short, unfinished, and likely to remain so for the whole of her lifetime. Mrs. Chegwin, for her part, asked no questions at all about what had transpired in London, only looked the two of them over with the same brisk, assessing eye she had turned upon Philippa's single battered trunk nearly a year before, and declared, with evident satisfaction, that they both looked considerably better fed than they had any right to after a fortnight, in a city known for starving its visitors on fashion rather than proper meals, and had a supper laid within the hour that neither of them, Philippa noted with some private amusement, managed to finish completely. She stood looking at the quay for a long while, that first evening after the household had settled, and the last of the summer light had finally failed over the water, and Nathaniel came to stand beside her at the window, without saying anything at all, only offering after a moment his hand. "We shall have to find some other way," she said eventually. "Not the pier you meant to build. Something smaller, perhaps, built upon whatever land remains within our own reach rather than the duchy's. It will not be what you spent 10 years working toward." "No," he agreed, "it will not." "I am sorry for it," she said, "truly." He turned from the window to look at her properly, and something in his face, in the steady, familiar warmth of it, told her he had long since made his peace with a bargain she still, some evenings, found herself grieving on his behalf. "I built 10 years of ledgers around the idea of that pier," he said, "because it was the only ambition I had left to hold on to, in a house that had very little else in it worth holding. I find this past year that I have acquired rather better company for the holding, and I do not know how to grieve a stone quay with any real conviction while I still have you standing beside me to grieve it with." It was Philippa, in the end, who first raised the notion of the smaller landing, some weeks later, poring over the estate maps spread across the library table with the same patient attention she had once brought to her mother's trust deed. A stretch of shingle beneath the home farm, well short of anything Coswell's lease could touch, too modest ever to draw the great merchant vessels Nathaniel had once dreamed of berthing there, but deep enough, she calculated, for the smaller coastal traders that carried ore and lime up and down this coast, in numbers nobody troubled to count. It would take her own income to build it, the 20,000 no longer forfeit to anyone, and Nathaniel had argued against the notion for the better part of an evening, before finally, quietly, agreeing that he had no better plan of his own left standing to argue in its place. It was not the harbor he had spent 10 years imagining. It was, Philippa thought, watching him trace the shoreline with one finger by candlelight, rather better suited to the two of them than that old ambition had ever been, built as it was on both their names together rather than his alone. Later that night, climbing the familiar stairs to the room that had been hers alone, since a broad, taciturn carpenter fitted a bolt to its door the previous August, Philippa paused at the landing and looked back down at her husband, still standing in the hall below, with the particular stillness she had come, over the past year, to recognize as its own quiet form of devotion. "Nathaniel," she said, "I do not think we shall need the bolt again tonight." Something shifted in his face, warm and unhurried, and he crossed the hall and climbed the stairs to join her, and Philippa understood, standing there in the lamplit dark of a house that had become, somewhere in the space of 11 difficult months, entirely her own, that whatever the sea had cost them both, it had not managed, in the end, to take the one thing her mother had spent 17 years quietly ensuring no one could ever again put beyond her reach: herself. The stone quay below the house remained exactly as it had always been, through that summer and the autumn that followed it, too shallow and too short, unfinished. A permanent small reminder, set against the water of everything a single winter afternoon in Truro had cost them both. But some evenings, standing at the library window with the harbor maps spread across the desk behind her, and her husband's hand resting warm against her own, Philippa found she could look at it without flinching, and understood that this, too, in its own quiet and unglamorous way, was a kind of victory she had not thought to hope for, on the morning she first stood veiled before a rain-soaked altar, a year and a lifetime ago.